Is there a way of... No.
I've never used After Effects,
Okay.
but I've had a little introduction to Cinema 4D.
Oh,
Okay.
nice. That's cool.
I've never used either software.
Never used either. Has anyone got any past experience with After Effects, or even if it's just even if it's just a little thing, just a little dipping your toes in or anything? It's okay if you haven't as well. It's like totally. We'll start from the top, so it's all good.
Not really. I've tried the Unreal Engine. That's all.
Nice. Cool. Oh yeah, I've been using it a bit recently actually at work. It's crazy. This is the craziest piece of software I've ever used. It's just absolutely mental.
Cool.
Yeah.
You think that maybe next year, Unreal is the way to go?
I mean, it's something to look into now, I would imagine. Definitely check it out. I mean, I think what's interesting is that it's being used a lot more now as a kind of like final presentation rendering tool,
Right.
rather than just a sort of niche sort of game engine.
Right.
It's like it really is like a mainstream production tool for not just games, but also like, you know, cinematic productions. Also lots of architectural visualization. I think that's really taken off. People love the idea of like getting the headset on, don't they? You
I
know.
think everybody's here. I think we can just begin.
I've
Is
got
there
one
somebody in
person
the-
to admit.
Okay.
Riyadh. Yep. So I have to
Riyadh.
keep checking that. You have to remind me. Please let me know if there's anyone waiting and I haven't noticed. I'll do my best to get them all in. Yeah, actually, so today I was thinking we could look at After Effects primarily, go through After Effects, and then if we're doing well, hopefully get like our toes a little bit into Cinema 4D as well. Maybe export something from, do some camera tracking and export that to Cinema 4D so you can see how a 3D camera moves. So what I'll do is I'll link you this document that I made so that you can see, so you can follow along. So I'll just copy a link to the chat for you here. So this document is just a sort of a bunch of notes, and if there are any questions that you have and I can't find the answer to, I'll write like a little note and try and get back to you. But that kind of gives you an overview of what I'm planning to show you today. I'll also share my screen with you as well, so you can see. So you can see what I can see. Okay. Can you see the screen? Is that all good?
Yes.
Good stuff. So yeah, we'll look at the interface, and then we'll go make some layers, make some compositions, do a bit of keyframing stuff. Then we'll do a few little effects. I'll show you how to use the pick whip because it's very useful. And yeah, and then maybe we can do some fun stuff. We can do some motion tracking or some camera tracking at the end. So maybe I'll just... Oh, the other thing to say is that we have this feature that we can use called breakout rooms. I don't know if you've used it before. I certainly haven't. But basically, if we get to a point where some of you are feeling a bit like you want to sort of review it in smaller groups or talk together in small groups, I can press the breakout rooms option, and then it will sort of automatically sort of divide all of the participants into groups, and then those smaller groups can talk to each other. And I think we'll try and take a break every hour or so, because it's quite a long, it can be quite a long session otherwise. So yeah, so maybe if there's no sort of questions before we start, maybe I'll just jump in. Does anyone have anything they want to like say, wait, I need to say this before we start, or is everyone okay?
Can we record the meeting?
Absolutely, yes. So I've got this OBS running, and it's recording the video and the sound, and I will upload this to YouTube afterwards as a private video, not as a public video. So you'll be able to review it. And if you
All
see
right.
that, so that little red light there means that it's running. So if that red light goes away, it means it's stopped recording. So let me know.
All right, thank you.
So anyone else? Anyone else got any? All right, let's jump in. So I've got After Effects here, and I think this is the latest version of After Effects. But what do we have? So I'll just go through the kind of like main sort of spaces. So actually, I should probably explain what After Effects is to begin with. It's kind of like it's a motion graphics and visual effects software. That's probably how I would describe it. So it's a place where you can create your own digital graphics from scratch, like using lines and vectors, a little bit like Illustrator. But it's also a place where you can take existing footage, media, images, videos, sequences of frames that you've rendered, and you can take those frames and you can modify them, adapt them, augment them, play with them, all this kind of stuff. It's a really good tool for kind of like very fine detailed editing. And in terms of complexity, it's quite a good balance, because you may have heard of other ones like Nuke, which is also a very good compositing VFX software. But the nice thing about After Effects is that it's fairly easy to kind of like get into, and it's fairly broadly used and pretty well understood. The other thing is that I've linked you to, I don't know if Stefan's probably sent you the working material folder, which is the Google Drive folder that he sent you. And in that folder, there's a bunch of subfolders with media. So I've got like a bunch of videos that are quite good for just demonstrating various features in lieu of apps of like actual sort of real content. We've just got a few kind of like bits and pieces here that we can work with. So hopefully, if you want to follow along, you can use these clips as well. So I'll be using only stuff hopefully from this folder, so you can follow along. So After Effects. So at the top here we've got our menu and our main tools. It's often good to go back to this arrow tool if you get sort of like nested deep into some kind of function. And then, there's a fly. And then here, if I press this little button here that says project, we've got the kind of like project window. And this is kind of like normally the starting point for After Effects. It's normally where you sort of like bring in your media. So you can right click in this window and you can press import, and then you can import a file, multiple files from libraries. Normally I just go to file. Normally I just import a file, and then from there you can choose some kind of media. It could be a video, it could be an image, it could be an Illustrator file, it could be you can actually import a Cinema 4D file as well. You can import 3D data, which hopefully we can cover at some point.
Can I ask something quick?
Please, yes.
When I opened the software, it says unsupported video driver. Is that okay? It just says you may experience performance degradation, instability, and data loss. Have you ever experienced like massive problems with that?
Not really. I'm guessing what it's saying is that your video card drive, when it says video driver, I'm guessing it means...
My video driver is the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1050. I mean, it just says unsupported video driver.
I had the similar thing, but I fixed it. You need to update the drivers, but it takes a bit of time.
Okay.
There's a really easy way to do it online. I'll try to find the link and send it to you.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Sorry, another question. Can someone put the Google Drive link maybe in the chat so we can follow along with the files, if that's possible?
I can do that. Yeah, sure. Let me just get it for you. Or maybe Stefan has it to hand. I don't know. I've got it here as well. Copy.
Hi, sorry, Nicholas. I think there's a colleague of ours that's in the waiting room.
Oh no, okay.
Yeah.
Do I need to stop sharing to let them in? Or maybe. Thanks for letting me know.
No worries.
There were 2 people. Okay, cool. Oh, that's good. And here's the link to the hi guys. If you just joined, there's the link to the Google Drive, so you can access the bits and pieces that I'll be using. I'll just go back to sharing my screen. Yeah, I think that's probably an issue with the video graphics card. You're probably just updating it. I've got NVIDIA control panel here, which helps me to update it quite easily. I just normally it notifies me and tells me that there's a update. But it's definitely a good thing to get your video card updated if you can. Oh no, sorry, it's GeForce Experience. It's the more kind of like commercial side of it. So yeah, anyway, you can right click in this area here. You can press import file, and then you can choose a piece of media. So choose this one, for example, and then you can see that once you've imported a piece of media, it shows up in a list here. So if I imported something else, it would come next to it, and you get some really nice, useful info about your footage here. So you get the file type, the size, the frame rate. It's a good idea to pay attention to the frame rate because that can cause issues with timing if you don't keep an eye on it. So definitely check the frame rate. The other thing you can do is you can just drag stuff in there as well. So if you want to, you can just take a piece of footage and just click and drag, and that will bring it in. Another thing that you might want to do is bring in a sequence of frames, so like a bunch of still images that form a sequence. So you can do that by going to the same thing that we went to before, file import, and then maybe if there's a JPEG sequence, I don't know if there is. Oh yeah, here we go. So I think this is a sequence. So if I click on the first, so you don't need to select all of them if you want to. So if I wanted to import all of these frames, I don't need to click all of them. I just need to click the first one and then press this option here, which is import a JPEG sequence. And that will just sort of go through and work out what the sequence is based on the file names. So that's quite a useful trick. And then you can see it comes in as a kind of, the icon is a kind of stacked, like a series of stacked images. And you'll notice also that is given a frame rate as well. So it's given that a frame rate of 25 frames per second. But because it's a sequence of images, it could be whatever frame rate we want it to be, really. So we can actually change that. It's not based on the images in any way, really. So if I right click on those images and go to interpret footage and then main, or you can press Control Alt G, you'll see here that you can actually set the frame rate. So if I wanted those frames to play back at, say, 60 frames per second, I could type 60 in here, and then it would play them all back a bit faster. So that's kind of how you load footage in. You can also make folders and organize stuff. It's fairly intuitive. But if you want, so the next thing to probably look at is like how to actually preview those pieces of footage. So if I take those frames that I imported, I can double click on them, and if I double click on them, you can see they pop up in this window here. So this is a video I took a long time ago at the terrace of the AA. Some of you will probably recognize it. And then you can see here, if I scrub through this, timeline here with the playhead, you can see that it plays through the footage. If I press play, it should play back. And I think that's probably playing back a little bit faster than when I originally took the footage, because I don't think it was originally captured at 60 frames per second, but it's playing back at 60 frames per second. So that's quite a useful tool to have. You can preview stuff before you use it. You can also, the other thing is that pay attention to the color of this bar. So you can see it's like a kind of turquoise, bluey color. Debatable, but it's like that. The color of that bar often indicates which kind of mode you're in. And currently I'm just previewing footage. So you'll see that changes as we do different things. And it's good to check that it's the right color. You can use these buttons here, the in point and the out point, to kind of trim the footage and to say, okay, I only want to use a section of the footage, which is quite useful because sometimes you've got like a very long clip that's got loads of stuff you don't want, and the bit that you want to work on is just one one small piece of footage, like where the event takes place. So you can always take your footage and trim it, which is quite good. So this kind of brings me to the next sort of bit of After Effects, which is the idea of like compositions. And so a composition is a little bit like what it sounds like. It's a compositing of either one or multiple pieces of media into a frame. So for instance, you could have two videos sitting in one frame, or you could have one video filling the whole frame and then maybe some kind of line overlaid onto it as a separate layer. But basically a composition would encompass all of those layers. So there's a few different ways to make compositions. One way you can do it is you can click on this create new composition icon, and then it will give you a menu with lots of options where you can specify exactly what you want that sort of container to be like, that composition to be like. So often I find myself using a setup quite similar to this with 1920 by 1080 pixels, which is a standard HD format. I guess some people nowadays are more using kind of like 4K as well, but I tend to stick with this for general use because it's fairly sort of manageable in terms of the number of pixels. So you can also specify a frame rate. So I could put 60 frames per second if I wanted to match the footage that I just imported as frames there. And you can also set the duration of the clip. So here I've got it set to 2,990 for some reason. I don't know why it's that. It seems a bit sort of random, but you could have 5,000 frames, for instance. The other thing to say is that you can always change these things afterwards. You don't have to stick with them. So it's always possible to change. So I just pressed OK, and we can see what happens is that the composition pops up as a new sort of item down here in this bottom section. And you can see we've got the kind of classic Adobe style transparency grid. I don't know if it's even Adobe style, but you've got the transparency grid here showing us that there's nothing in the frame. It's just an empty composition basically. And there's but then it's probably good to show you that there is another way to create compositions, which is to simply take your footage and to drag it onto the icon. So it's slightly different to just clicking it. You take your footage and you drag it onto the icon. And what that does is it creates a composition, but it uses the footage that you're dragging into it as the source for the settings. So if your footage was captured at 25 frames per second, it will make sure that the composition matches your footage. And that's pretty handy because it saves you having to like type in all of the details of like how many frames per second, what's the resolution, etc., etc., etc. It will just take everything that you've got and match it, and it will match the duration as well. So when we specified that in point and that out point for this footage, it's going to remember what those were. It's going to make sure that it's going to make sure that the composition matches it. So hopefully that makes sense. Does anyone have any questions at that point? Want to sort of like say, hey, it didn't work? Or
just a quick question. So a composition, what would be the difference between just raw footage or whatever it is and a composition?
Yeah, so the difference is that composition can take multiple. It can be a container for multiple pieces of footage. So if I took this layer, for instance, and I pressed Control-C, Control-V, I could duplicate it a couple of times, and you could see that then we could have multiple instances of the footage within one composition.
Oh, okay.
Whereas,
right.
So yeah, that's a really good point though, because I didn't really sort of properly say that. But yeah, the way to think of a composition is like almost like how in a Photoshop file you've got different layers. A composition similarly can hold multiple video layers at the same time, and as you can see here, they all stack up in layers, so you have a sort of intuitive sense of like which one is on top, if you like. That's sort of a fundamental thing, really. Everyone else kind of reasonably on board? That's good. So here what I've done is I've just very carelessly duplicated my footage 5 times. And you can see that I've got 5 layers popping up here in the composition. So once you've dragged an image into the composition, you can actually play around with its properties, much the same way that you can play around with the properties of a Photoshop layer. If you click on the layer and then press this little arrow here, it will expand the properties, and then if you click the next arrow, it will expand them even further. And if your layer has got lots of attributes, you can find that this becomes a very quickly expanding tree of properties and parameters that you can play with. So you can see in here, also what it's done is it's kind of highlighted, you see these little handles on the footage, it's highlighted which one we're using, which is this one here. So we can see that with these attributes, we're going to be editing this instance of the footage. So if I were to change the opacity, for instance, you can see that it fades away. You can set the opacity. I can also use these parameters to set the position. So I can set the X position, the Y position. This footage also has an anchor point, or I should say this layer has an anchor point, which you can change. And that's that little, I don't know if you can see it, it's like a little crosshair in the very center of the footage. And that's like a kind of, like a sort of pivot point, if you like. So if you were rotating, it would rotate around that point as its pivot. You can change the scale. If you press the chain link icon, you can set it so that it scales disproportionately on different axes. So you can scale the X and the Y. But that's always a bit of a scary thing to do because you can lose your aspect ratio. And then we've got rotation, and we've got opacity. So we can basically stack as many layers as we like into this composition. Although it's good to be aware that as you do, you're probably going to increase the strain on your computer. So more layers is going to incur a greater difficulty in terms of like playing them back. But as in the previous window I showed you, you can play through the footage by scrubbing through this timeline, and if you press the spacebar, it will play. So now we've got quite a trippy sort of like kaleidoscope of multiple pieces of footage playing back at the same time, which might make you feel sick if you look at it too much. So I'm going to stop. And yeah, so we can put as many layers in here as we like. If you find something that often happens is that you find that the playback becomes very slow because your computer is just crunching through so many pixels. Even if you have a really good graphics card, it's very easy to overwhelm it in After Effects, because After Effects is very high fidelity in the sense that it will very what's the word? It'll be very true to the pixels that it's supposed to show you. You can change the quality of this preview here by changing this setting here from full to half or third or quarter. Or so if I set it to quarter, you can see that it becomes a little bit more pixelated. And it's just reducing the quality so that it plays back a bit more smoothly. So if you have problems with playback, it's very good to sort of like play around with this setting here, which defines the quality. You can also toggle the transparency grid as well using this button. So that's just toggling between having the transparency as a checkerboard or having the transparency as just a black background. So you've got that option available to you as well. So we've got a couple of layers in here. And I think these are just called footage layers or image layers. But there are other types of layers that you can add in After Effects. So if I just delete all of these but one, maybe if I just keep one of them there, and if I toggle my transparency grid, like I showed you before, we can create a new type of layer on top of it, which you might be sort of vaguely familiar with in maybe in Illustrator, which is called a shape layer. So if I right click on the composition and go to New and Shape Layer, you can see that this new shape layer pops up in blue, And a shape layer is basically just a sort of vector-based shape. So like a line, a shape, a block, like a cube, a highlight, a square, a rectangle, a triangle, something like that. By default, I think it gives you the rectangle tool, but I'm just going to go back up to my tool panel here and choose the pen tool. And then you can use that to sort of define some Bezier points to sort of click and drag. And so I guess this is quite useful because from, in architecture school, often the line is a very sort of fundamental way to annotate, to describe, to draw, to communicate. So lines are often a very good way to sort of to demonstrate things. So here I've just drawn a line. I've drawn my shape layer, and you can see that it sits on top of. If I were to sort of click it and drag it a bit, so I just clicked on a handle by mistake there. But if I select the whole thing and I move it, you can see that it sits over the top. I can overlay it onto my video, and my video will play back hopefully with it. And if I expand the properties of that shape layer, I get lots more options. So if I go into contents and then shape and then path, I can define the path. I can define the stroke. So here, for instance, I can define how thick I want that line to be. So I can define the line width. I can also define the color. So I could have it like if I wanted a red line, I could make it a red line. I can also do this very useful thing called a trim path, which you may have heard of before. But if I click here and go to this little add button with a circle and a play icon, it's a bit of a confusing icon, but if I click on that and go to trim paths, you can see I get a new attribute. So this is kind of something that you do quite a lot in After Effects. You add extra attributes to existing layers in your composition. So here I'm adding the trim path attribute to the line, and that allows me to sort of define the endpoint of the line. So you can see that red, the position of that curve is showing me how much of that line I want to use, if that makes sense. So if part of your video was to illustrate a line drawing itself, that would be a very good way to do it, basically. And so, does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone have any questions there? It's probably quite a good point to sort of say. Does anyone want to jump in? All good. So the next thing I want to talk about probably is keyframes, because these parameters are all well and good, but they're not much use if you can't kind of control them over time. So that brings us to keyframes, and you'll see that lots of these attributes have got this little stopwatch icon next to them. And if you see that stopwatch, it means that the parameter or the property can be animated. So if I take this attribute, the trim path that I was dealing with before, and I press the stopwatch, it was quite subtle, but if you look in the timeline, you can see that something has appeared. So you can see here, this little blue diamond has showed up. And that basically means that there is a keyframe for that attribute at that point in time. So at this frame, frame 69, we've got a keyframe for the endpoint of our trim. And then if I move my timeline along here, say to frame 89, and then I change my trim path again, what you'll notice is that it creates another keyframe here. And now if I move between those two keyframes, it's remembered the interpolation between those 2 points on the line. So that's basically how you create, how you animate a property. So I could animate a property of the footage, for instance. I could animate the opacity. So maybe if I just move the layer to the top, and then go into the opacity settings and set a keyframe for opacity, move my timeline, set another keyframe, and then maybe I take it back again to 100. You can see that the opacity of that layer is changing over time, which is quite useful because it means that you have the ability to blend between parameters and layers and shapes and all this kind of stuff, at will, basically. So you have lots of flexibility. And I guess the other thing that's probably a good thing to mention is that these keyframes have different interpolations. So the kind of standard interpolation that they'll use is linear, and that just means it's going from point A to point B directly. But there are other forms of interpolation, for instance, Bezier interpolation, which is where it doesn't go straight from A to B. It kind of starts off slowly, then it speeds up, and then it slows down again towards the end. So if I click and drag on these keyframes here for my curve, and I right-click and go to... actually, a good way to show that is probably with the graph view. So there are two ways of viewing these layers. One is just as kind of like layers with dots, like what we call a dope sheet view. But the other way to view them is using graphs. So if I click on this graph editor button, you'll see that there's a line going between those 2 points. So that's saying at this point in time, the curve trim path is down here at, what's it, like 37 or something? And then at this point in time, it's at 100. And it's saying go between those 2 points in a linear fashion, just go straight between them. But you can also do a Bezier interpolation. So if I think if I select these objects in the graph, and then I click on this button here, it will do what's called easy ease. And that's basically a Bezier interpolation. So you can see now it's kind of formed like a kind of S-curve, a sort of like smooth, sinusoidal sort of interpolation. And that means that it's going to start off slowly at the beginning, and then it's going to, whoa, okay, well, it's really fast, because it's like a really fast animation. But if I stretch it out a little bit, you should be able to see that it starts off slowly. Okay, that was way too fast. Maybe I need to go back a step. Perhaps if I stretch this to the whole duration. So if I play back the animation, can you see how it sort of starts off a little bit sluggish, and then it kind of accelerates, and then it kind of slows down again? That's because of the interpolation of that spline. And the really nice thing is that you can go in, you can pull on these handles, and you can kind of make it even more extreme if you want to. So I could set it so that it's really sluggish at the start, and then it kind of and then it does this kind of fast curve of acceleration, and then it slows down again. Let me just turn off this other layer as well to make it more clear. So you can see it's sluggish, and then it goes whoom, and then it slows down again at the end, and that's because of the interpolation. Does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone have any sort of questions about that? And I mean, the nice thing is that you can apply that to any attribute in any layer as well. So if you wanted your opacity to change in the same manner, you could do that to it. You could do that to it as well. So let me just have a look at my sheet and see. Just want to check that I'm sort of giving you a good overview and covering everything. So we've got composition layers. Yeah, it'd probably be good. I think I'll probably just explain to you a few of what these buttons and things do in the timeline, because there's a lot of complicated kind of little bits and pieces in here. So I talked to you about all of the attributes, and the fact that you can add more attributes to objects as you go, and you can kind of make the objects more complex depending on what you want them to do.
Sorry, Nick.
Sorry.
Really sorry to interrupt.
No.
I just joined from my laptop because I was on my phone. Is it okay if you accept me into the?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Let me.
That's okay. Thanks a lot.
Just check. Oh yeah, sorry. I see the admit. Let me know if you see that and I'm not clicking it.
Yeah.
I don't want to
Great.
stop people
Thanks
from
a lot.
getting it. That's all right. No problem. Thanks for mentioning it. So yeah, for instance, if I wanted to add more attributes to this, I could. Like if I wanted to, so you have this box here called the effects and presets. I don't know what it is, like a window, a box, a dialogue. If I wanted to apply a sort of blur to this line, I could search for blur, and because it's After Effects, there's like a million different ways to blur something. But if I go for like maybe there's like some kind of like a quick blur or a fast blur. What do we have? VR blur. Wow, there's so many different types of blur. I think I would know which one to choose, but I just really don't. Maybe okay, let's go for fast box blur because that sounds quick. So if I click that and drag it onto my line layer, I'm hoping it should actually blur the line. Yeah, there we go. So that effect is now causing the line to be a bit blurry. Maybe I'll sort of tone it down a little bit so it's not quite so extreme. Maybe just like 5 pixels of blur. So we can see that now there's a new attribute that's appeared called effects, and so it's a bit confusing because it shows up in this window here, which we were previously using to navigate your project. But don't worry, your project's still there. You just have to click on the project tab. But confusingly, it's now gives you the option of the project or the effect. But you can also change the effect down here in the attributes of the layer. So you can set the blur radius here, for instance, if that's. And sometimes it's more useful to set it like that because that's kind of what you're working on. And the other thing that it is another like little tip is that if you've set a keyframe, so say you've set the keyframe for the blur radius, and all of your layers were closed, and you're like, I really want to like tweak that blur radius keyframe, but I don't know how to find it. It's going to take me ages to dig through all the layers. If you select the layer that you know it's on, and then you press U, it will just show you that attribute that you've keyframed. So U is a really good U as in I don't know what I'm talking about. U as in U. It will just expose those attributes which have keyframes. So that's quite a good hotkey for kind of like just quickly getting to the bits that you want, like because otherwise if you don't press U, you get kind of like 50 different like attributes, and it can just get a bit kind of overwhelming. So I definitely recommend pressing U as a way to sort of like just compress them all. You also have lots of. Oh, sorry.
Does U stand for all the effects?
I think possibly, yeah. I think it might be. So there's a good. If you go to this link here, it's got loads of After Effects shortcuts, and there's like millions of them. So you can become like a real hotkey wizard, and you can like learn how to like quickly change all of the attributes. Maybe if I search for U, of course there's going to be lots of U's, hundreds of U's. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's basically show all attributes. Yeah, because it toggles. If you keep pressing it, it toggles through showing everything, and showing nothing, and showing just the ones that are keyframed. So it's quite a good button just to sort of spam it.
Okay, not just for effects. Okay.
Yeah, not just for effects. Sorry, that's what you were asking.
Yeah.
Okay. No, not just for effects. It does everything. It's quite useful. But there's all this other stuff as well. Like you have the eye icon, which is quite intuitive. It just changes the visibility. So if I toggle the visibility of the layer, it turns it off. You still see the spline, but that's just a helper to let you know where it is. If you deselect the layer, it disappears. If your footage has got audio, which sometimes it does, that can be toggled as well. So I don't know I think this spaceships one has got audio. So yeah. So you can see that this one with the spaceships has got a bit of sound that goes along with it. And if I press the sound icon, it will toggle the sound. So that's quite nice. If you want to go into more detail in the sound, you can expand the attributes, go into audio, and you can actually see, I think it will show you the waveform. It's a bit quiet, but here you can see the actual sound wave, or the amplitude of the wave during the composition. If I just make my composition a bit longer here, if I change it to like 300 frames, I'll be able to see it a bit more clearly. So yeah, here you can see the sound changing as the clip progresses, which is quite nice. And you'll notice here that you can keyframe the audio levels. Excuse me. So if you want to have your clip easing in gradually, you can have the volume kind of slowly coming up. I'm just gonna go to the zoom setting here and change this to fit. You can choose different zoom levels for your composition, but I like to use fit because it just automatically squeezes the composition into the view. And then if sometimes you want to zoom in and like look at like a little detail, like 3 pixels or something, but then you can always go back to fit and fit it in the screen, which is quite nice. There are lots of other things you can do as well. I think this column here toggles the solo view, and so what that means is that if you have like a number of different elements on your screen. So say I had my what did I have? Oh, did I change the trim path? Yeah, so say you had like all 3 things on the screen, and you just wanted to focus on one temporarily, you can press the solo button and it will just show you that layer on its own. And then if you press it again, it will reveal the others. So it's like the opposite of turning off a layer. It's like only turning on that layer. There's a padlock icon, which is intuitive. It will just lock the layer, meaning that you can't accidentally make changes to it. So once you're happy with your layer, you'll see here there's the name. You can rename it. If you press return, you can call it any name. You also have a mode dialog, and this is very similar to Photoshop, where you have different overlay methods, where you have like multiply, hard color, light color, screen, luminosity, saturation, etc., etc., etc. They're all listed here. So if you wanted to multiply one layer, well, I say maybe I could try and find a way to overlay this onto here. If we used maybe screen or something like that, see that it puts it gets rid of all the black and just puts like a very faint kind of overlay of those spaceships on top of the existing footage. If I just drag this out a bit as well, we can see all of it. So there I'm just sort of extending the clip a bit further. So you can choose all these different overlay methods as well to blend between your footage, which can be can use up a lot of time, like playing with overlay methods. But when you get it right, it's just very satisfying. So yeah, we got that. We got the option to blend it in different ways. There's a button here. What's that? T transparency. I'm not actually sure what that does, but I think that's somehow blending the transparency between the other layers. I'll have to get back to you on that one. There's a button here called with a little nose peeking over a wall, and I think that's an option to make the layer shy. So if you make a layer shy, it means that it's hiding. So if I click it, you can see that the little guy hides underneath the wall, and then he pops, like when he's shy, he's hiding beneath the wall, and when he's not shy, he's above the wall. So if you make the layer shy, it will mean that when you press the shy kind of toggle at the top here, it will hide all of the shy layers. So all of the shy layers will hide themselves. And that's good because sometimes your composition gets really busy with loads and loads of different layers and shapes and things, and you just want to focus on like a few important ones. So you can use the shy to toggle that. Then you've got the this little step icon here, and that controls the quality of the sampling. So I think when you've got it, set to like a horizontal line going that way. I don't know which way it is for you because I think my camera might be flipped. But the diagonal line means it's just doing a kind of nice anti-aliased interpretation of the pixels. Maybe it's a bit specific, but for all intents and purposes, you probably want to have. For most situations, you probably just want to have it at the default. So maybe don't worry too much about that. Here we've got the frame blending. So if you have very low frame rate footage, like say I took my footage of the AA and I interpreted it at not 60 but like 1 frame per second, then when I brought it in, the way that it played back would be very kind of stuttery. So it would be like, okay, well, we didn't even see a single frame there. It was like 1 second or something. Yeah, so you can see it's kind of just very slowly kind of like moving between the frames. And if you press frame blending, what it will do is it will try to sort of like create the frames in between the frames. So it will sort of do its best to kind of like give it a sense of motion. So you can see even at a very low frame rate, it's doing a kind of, it's quite subtle, but you can see that it's kind of like subtly kind of like stepping frames in between the frames and trying to work out where they should be. So that's useful if you have a piece of footage where you can't change the frame rate and you need it to be higher. And there's different, if you keep clicking it, there's different methods for interpolation. But warning, it can be very slow to process because it has to do a lot of work to calculate the intermediate frames. You also have this option here, which is the motion blur. So you see those three little circles stacked on top of each other. That indicates motion blur. And so if you if I turn the blur down on this thing, if I like get rid of this blur, then maybe we can see it. Oh yeah, okay, so you can see it a bit there. So you see how the end of the curve is turned into a gradient. It's not because we specified a gradient, it's because we turned on the motion blur. And when we turn on the motion blur, it's going to sample, it's going to take subframes and it's going to sample it on subframes, and then it's going to blur it as it goes in between. So you always have that. It's nice to have that option, because sometimes if you have a piece of footage that's like very fast paced, the motion blur can help to sort of enhance the feeling of it being, you know, very rapid. Or if you want to convey motion, it can be a very useful tool for conveying motion. But it will only work with these kind of vector objects. It won't work so well with, actually, that's a good question. Will it work with other types of object? I wonder if I move this object very fast across the screen, whether it will blur. If I turn on the motion blur and add some keyframes here. Sorry, this is like a bit of a live experiment. Oh yeah, it does. Okay, so look. So I have this image moving quickly across my screen, and you can see that it's applied the motion blur to it because it's just moving so fast. It won't create blur within the footage itself, if that makes any sense. So it won't blur between the pixels, but it will blur the layer itself as the layer moves across the screen. And if you want to crank up the blur or tone it down a bit, you can right click on the you can right click in this blank space here and go to composition settings, and then in the advanced tab you can specify the shutter angle. And so if I set that to like 720, you can see that the blur gets more intense. And if that was too much, then you can turn it down to 180, and then it's less blurry. So you have a lot of, it's quite nice. You have a lot of control over the sort of like, I guess like dramatic feel of the footage can be, or the thing can be influenced with that setting. So bear with me, we're getting there. We've nearly covered all of them. And then there's also this one here called adjustment layer. And I think that what that does is it uses the layer above as a filter. So if you have like a so like in Photoshop you have a mask to filter out certain bits of the image, it works the same as that. So if I had like a black and white layer, so if I go to if I create like a new shape layer, and it's like a so say I create like a black rectangle. If I press is that right? Adjustment layer, effects applied to this layer, apply to the composite of layers below it. Oh, sorry, yeah, I know what this does. So basically I explained that completely wrong. Ignore what I just said. So basically if you have an effect applied to this layer, it will apply to all of the ones below it. So if I take my box blur and I put it on this new shape layer, and then I make that into a adjustment layer, theoretically it will apply it to all of the layers below. But it doesn't seem to have done that, actually. It doesn't seem to be blurring it. Anyway, to be honest, I don't use that very often, but there is an option there if you need it. And then finally we have this option here called, I think it's 3D. And if you press that, the little cube appears in the box. And that means that you've turned that layer into a 3D layer. And it doesn't really look like much to begin with, but you can see that you get these like X, Y, Z kind of widgets on the thing. And you'll notice that the attributes of the object change slightly as well. So here we've got X rotation, Y rotation, Z rotation. So we can actually now change the X rotation and we can make it a 3D object. So you can see here that it's it's quite a weird sort of like thing that we're doing, I suppose, like blurring an object to make it move. But it then gives you not just 2 dimensions of freedom to move the object around, but 3. So you can start to sort of get very interesting effects when you play around with these. By the way, if you mess up an attribute and you want to get it back to the way it was, you can always just right click on it and go to reset, and that will put it back to its like default position. That happens a lot, like when you're playing around with attributes and layers and stuff. Sometimes you just need to like flick it back to where it was, start again. So those are the main buttons. There's also the other thing that you can do is you can parent an object to another object. So you can say, right, I've got one object that's moving, but I want these 5 other objects to follow it. So I'm going to create a new type of object, which is called a null object. So I'm going to go to right click in the composition, go new, and then select null object. And a null object is basically just a sort of placeholder, a position in space that it won't actually render when you render your final sequence, but it's useful as a kind of tool for manipulating, like a sort of pivot point for other objects. So you can see I've got my null here. If I bring it to the top of my layers, and I've got these other 2 layers as well. I've got my footage and I've got my line. And if I wanted them to follow the movement of this null, what I can do is I can select the null as their parent in the parent and link section. So here I'm just choosing both of these objects as the child, if you like, of the null. And now if I move the null, you can see that they move with it. So it could be a very, if you want to like make kind of like groups of objects that move together, it can be very useful. And even if I change the, rotation of or the scale of my null, all of those, the other 2 objects will follow. They can still be independently animated as children. So you can you could animate the rotation of this between 2 keyframes. Whoops, sorry, that's the scale. But say I were to animate the rotation like this. So they start rotating around the null. You can see that the spline still retains its attributes. So there's a kind of like, it starts to create a hierarchy of guiding the animation. And you can see actually that that this piece of footage is still moving down in its own relative space as well, if that makes sense. So you can kind of nest animations within different objects. Does anybody want to jump in there and say something, or like intervene, or like have a question?
I just have a question about the 3D thing.
Oh yeah.
Can you specify if it's parallel or perspective view?
Yeah, I think it's perspective by default. I don't know if you can do a parallel view. Maybe. I'm pretty sure it's perspective. Wait, let's have a look. We can test it. If we get our yeah, okay, so this piece of footage here is 3D. Let's just go to a better frame. Whoops. I think it's perspective, and I'm not sure you can have it any other way. Actually, that looks like parallel, doesn't it? Oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
It doesn't. Yeah, I see what you mean. It looks like a parallel projection. So here's something to know. You can maybe, I think possibly by default you're looking at a parallel projection, but if you want, you can introduce a 3D perspective projection, and the way to do that is to create a camera object. So this is just another type of layer that you can add, slightly confusingly because you don't normally think of a camera as a layer. But if I right click and I go new camera, you can see that this dialog comes up to create a new camera. And I think that the After Effects camera dialog is really nice because it gives you all of these, like, it gives you the diagram of the camera itself. So we know that we've got like an angle of view of 75 degrees, film size of 36, etc., etc., etc. You could put in your own, you could look up the specification of your smartphone, for instance, and put those parameters in here as the camera, so that it matches. But basically, if you create that camera, and then if you make sure that the camera that's selected here in this menu is the name of that camera, so camera 1, then as long as you do that, it will use the attributes of that camera. So now it's definitely a perspective camera, and you can kind of see it, can't you? You can see that it's sort of, there's a vanishing point through the angle of the lines. And if I go in and I change that camera, if I give it like a wider field of view, or a narrower field of view, oh no, sorry, that's a wider field of view, then you can see that the objects kind of shrink in a bit because they're changing in the field of view. Although you notice that this spline object hasn't changed, and that's because it's not 3D. But you can also you could toggle 3D as well for that object.
So are all the 3D objects under the camera layer will be in the camera scene?
Sorry, they'll be
like the camera layer. Is that going to apply to all of the 3D objects that's underneath that layer?
Yes, that's right. Yep. But for instance, you could have like camera 2, camera 3, and the one that you see in your result is only the one that you've selected here. So it's a little bit weird because you can have multiple cameras, but you can only look through one at a time, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
But yeah, it's good. It's good to have the option. You can actually split this viewport into 2, or into as many sections as you like. Really, if you go to this section here, there are different options. So, for instance, you can have 2 views horizontal. So what it's done is it's split the kind of composition view. One of them is like this side, for instance, is looking through the camera, and this side is looking at the scene from the top view. So here we can see the camera with its cone coming outwards like that, and then we can see the objects kind of laid out in plan. So you can see we've got our null. There's our null object there. There's our blue line for our spline, and there's our footage. So you can kind of like, similar to like Rhino or other 3D CAD, you can like look at the thing from different perspectives. The trouble is you can't expect the same kind of like snapping and kind of like tolerances and precision, but you can at least see what's going on in the view. When we get to Cinema 4D, you'll see that you have a lot more options in that regard. So you have a lot more freedom and control. But just so you know, you do have those options in in that. Hopefully that helps. Okay, that's good. Does anyone else get stuck or like have a question or wanna? It's all being recorded, so if you need to review, you can always review. Okay, that's good. That's good. Okay, so yeah, so many things to cover. It's amazing. Like when you open After Effects, it looks quite plain, but there's just millions and millions of things to talk about. Does anyone have like a particular feature that they want to look at, so I don't miss it for you, or like something that they really wanted to, or that wasn't on the sheet, the notes, because we can just keep going. Okay, let's keep going. Let's try. Okay, we'll try one more thing, and then we'll have like a break. Maybe. Does that sound good? Maybe like a 5-minute break. So, because lots of you are from, all of you are from architecture school? Yes, all of you are from architecture school. You might want to import lines into your scene for some reason. Well, for a good reason. So maybe if I just put this back to one view, you can import Illustrator files into After Effects. It's really useful. So I'm just going to right click in my project here. I'm going to go to Import File, and then I'm going to choose from my working material folder. I'm going to go to the AI folder, and I'm just going to choose test shapes. I think this one works. And this can be any Illustrator file. It doesn't have to be this one. It doesn't have to be formatted in a particularly special way. You get a dialog. You can either choose to merge all of the layers, but don't worry, you can separate them later, or you can just choose one specific layer from your file. So maybe you've done a really complex drawing, or you've exported a really complex drawing to Illustrator, and you're just concerned with like the topography lines, for instance. You can choose your topography layer in here. I'm just going to merge these layers for now, but just know that you have the option. So you can bring an Illustrator file straight into After Effects. Pretty nice. Adobe, Adobe Creative Suite experience, if you like. And then you have your, and then you can drag your Illustrator layers into your composition. So we now have a layer that we can play around with the same way as all the other layers. I mean, that's fine and that's fair enough, but like you could have done that anyway with like a bitmap. What's really nice is that you can take those lines and you can expand them as After Effects curves, so that you can manipulate the trim paths, or you can like blur them individually or something like that. So the way to do that is to right click on the Illustrator file, go to, I think it's, how do you do it? Reveal, create. Yeah, so if you right click on the layer, go to create, and then go to create shapes from vector layer. And what it will do is it will create a new shape layer above it. So it will turn off the visibility of this one, create a new layer on top. Excuse me. And inside that layer, if you expand the contents, you'll see that there are 4 groups, and they encompass the different parts of that shape. So now the nice thing is that we don't just have a representation of the vector file. We actually have the vectors themselves to play with. So, for instance, I could do my trim paths thing here, and I could start to trim the location of this path. So so then I can suddenly animate whatever I've created in Illustrator, which is a nice feature to have. I guess some of you might be working with Rhino. I think you can export. I think you can do like a Make 2D and export Illustrator lines. You can there's definitely ways around it using like SVG, AI, Make 2D, and exporting between different applications. So I just wanted to let you know that you have that kind of capability. So you have vector drawing tools at your disposal in After Effects, which is good to know. And then I don't know, maybe that's good. Is there anything else that I haven't really covered? I'll tell you what, let's take a break. Let's come back here in let's say 5 minutes. So let's say, okay, I'll tell you what, let's come back here at 1:15, and we'll pick up where we left off. Maybe you guys want to get a drink or just like take a little bit of a break, but let's say 1:15, meet back here. Sound good? Thumbs up? Or
Dude, can I just ask really quick question?
Please. Yep.
Every time you've done the trim path, I've been looking away. Can you just really quickly show me where it is?
Yeah, sure. So this is being recorded as well, by the way. But you just go to your layer, go to contents. Yeah. And then you should see it next to the content section.
Ah, right. Okay.
Next to a little arrow with a play. I think it could be a bit weird. The thing is, I think it can be different in different versions of After Effects. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it should be there.
Okay, found it. Thank you very much.
That's good. Good stuff. Okay. All right. I'm just gonna see you back in 1:15. All right. Good stuff. Okay. I'm just gonna mute and stop sharing. Next. Good stuff. All right. This thumbs up thing is great. It's so simple. Okay. Sorry, it's my first time. I've never done one of these like big Zoom workshop things before. But yeah, I mean, so hopefully you all got a chance to have a little bit of a breather or stand up, stretch your legs. I feel like even an hour is a bit too long sometimes. It's like you need like 45 minutes or something. Was there anything? Did anyone have any like loose ends or like bits and pieces that they weren't like? That they feel I missed. Obviously, you can always you'll always be able to review it on YouTube with a transcript, so you can like search for a particular keyword and it will give you a time. But I don't know. Was there anything that that I sort of like glossed over? Because I'm aware that it's quite a big surface area in terms of like software and stuff. Don't know if anyone had any suggestions, maybe. Okay.
Hi. Yeah.
Oh, yep.
Actually, I have a question.
Nice.
So, what if you are importing different Illustrator files? Is there any way of kind of snapping them all to an exact to the same precision, basically.
Yeah, that you can snap in a little bit in After Effects, but it's not really something that you want to rely on. So probably the best thing is to go to Illustrator and make sure that your canvas is set up to the video format that you're using. So it's a bit tricky because you don't always know exactly what you're doing. But if you start working, like if you create a canvas in Illustrator, which is a 1080p canvas, I think you have that option here. Yeah, like HD, HDTV 1080. If you work with that, then you should find that there is a one-to-one relationship between the canvases when you go back into video. So that will probably be my recommendation.
Okay, great.
You can always like shuffle it around. Like if you have a drawing that's like a strip or something, you can always like animate it. But it's best practice to normally define your canvas beforehand and make sure that it matches the video. That's a good question. Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Because sometimes you get the illusion that everything is like seamlessly integrated, but often there are things that are just, a pain and like slightly manual labor in between. Yeah. Let's have a look at the sheet and see what we're up to. So, okay, pre-composing. These ones are interesting. Mask adjustment moves. So masks are very interesting. They're a bit counterintuitive in After Effects. So there's a type of layer called a solid, and the solid is basically just like an object that fills the whole canvas, with a solid color. Maybe it's not that weird, but if you right click on your composition here and you go to new, you can also add layers by going to the layer menu. Excuse me as well. If you go to layer, there's normally like two ways to do everything. If you go to layer, new, and then solid, it will give you this dialog, and then you can choose the color of the solid. So if I were to choose this red solid, which is set to the dimensions of my composition, it will create a big red layer that just fills the whole screen. And it's kind of like, well, what's that kind of like useful for? But it's surprisingly useful. Like so say for instance that you needed to kind of like filter out an object, like a composition with like a 50% black fade. It's very useful because you can just set the opacity to 50%, and then it will fade everything with that opacity and that color. And the other thing that you can do with solids is that you can apply masks to them, and you can actually apply masks to all different types of layers in After Effects. But if you click on this, so if you have your solid selected and you click on this rectangle tool, or in fact the ellipse tool, and then you start drawing on top of it, you'll see that it suddenly converts the solid into the shape of the thing that you're drawing, and that's because you've basically created a mask on it. And in fact, it's probably easier to demonstrate a mask on a piece of footage. So maybe if I just like get a piece of footage from my import a new piece of footage from the working material folder. Let's get something a bit fresh. Like, actually, we've got that one already, haven't we? Yeah. So we've got this kind of like snowy scene. So I'm just going to drag that into a new composition. And what you can do with a mask is that you can say, okay, mask off all of this bit of the footage and leave this bit. So if I click and drag with the, if I click and drag on the footage with this ellipse tool selected, it will by default create a mask on that object. And so if you go to the properties of that footage, you can see that it's got a mask object in it now. And there's all kinds of things you can do with the mask. Like you can set it to, you can set the mode for the mask. So currently it's set to add, which means that inside the mask it will add data, and outside the mask it will remove data, which is why we have this kind of circular vignette effect. But if I were to put it to subtract, you can see that it only includes the area outside the mask instead. If you have more than one mask, this is where it gets a bit confusing. You can tell it to intersect with other masks. So if I were to copy this, I think if I were to add a new mask, That's how it would work. So here now I've got two masks. I've got this main one, and then I've got the sort of satellite one onto it. And if I set that one to intersect, then you get the area that's the intersection of both masks, if you know what I mean. So it lets you do kind of like quite complex masking operations, so you can filter out very specific bits of footage. And you can... Actually, maybe if I just delete that mask for now, because it's a bit confusing. You can change the feather, so you can kind of like blur the edges. You can change the opacity here. And you can also change the feather, so the blurriness of the mask. So if you wanted to do like a kind of like a soft vignette on your footage, you could use something like that, and then maybe you should change the opacity. Okay, well the opacity is going to make it darker, but if we had used a solid, like if we'd used a black solid and we were masking out that little bit, when we could change the opacity and we could change the intensity of the vignette. So it's quite a nice way to frame footage sometimes. And the other really nice thing is that all of these properties are animatable again. So if I click on mask path, and then I move my frames forward a bit, and then I change, so if I use this like pen tool to change the mask slightly, so I don't know, actually I'm actually going to use this arrow icon here, and I'm going to click outside of the mask, and then you'll see that you get like a slightly different selection method with Bezier handles. And so if I were to do this, if I were to change the position of the mask further down the line, because I've pressed this mask path keyframe option, the mask is actually going to change over time. So that's also quite useful, because sometimes you want to like use a mask to like pixelate or blur out a certain part of the footage, and then the footage changes over time, so you can actually have that mask adapting to whatever's happening in the footage. And I can also show you a bit of motion tracking, so you can like automatically track objects as well, which is quite useful. Yes, that's masking. There's also a very useful thing that you can do called pre-composing, and it's a little bit weird to wrap your head around it, but I'll try and sort of explain it to you. If we have like if we have a composition that's got lots of different elements in it, so if I just like drag a few of these things in here and make it a bit more complex, so these could be layers of your drawing, or perhaps a sort of media landscape that you've been assembling through the course of your project. You might find that this layer system gets very complex, and all like, say for instance, all you want to do is like, trim it and cut it down a bit. The problem here is that we have to trim and we have to cut like 3 different layers, so it becomes like a very complex operation. But there's this very nice feature called pre-composing, which lets you take all of those layers, group them, and then push them into another composition, so that it collapses 3 layers into one, but still allows you to edit the layers elsewhere. So if I select these 3 layers and I right-click on them and go to pre-compose here, you get a dialog box that pops up, and normally I choose this option here, move all attributes into the new composition. So what this is going to do is it's going to create a new composition with these layers in, and then in this composition it's going to leave just a single strip for me to edit. So if I press OK, you can see that those 3 layers have collapsed down into one, and then I think what we get is like a new composition called pre-comp. I told you it was a bit confusing. So it's put pre-comp inside this comp. And if I wanted to go and edit my original layers, I could click on pre-comp. You can just double click on the layer and it will take you to that composition. So there's my 3 layers. And then if I go back to the one I just was working on originally, I've just got this nice single strip. So sometimes you do like a bunch of really complicated stuff with lots of different layers, and then you're like, right, I just want to cut the whole thing at that point. So then you can pre-compose it, and then, for instance, you could, if you wanted to cut this, for instance, you can select the layer and just press Control-Shift-D is a good shortcut for cutting a layer in 2. So you see it's just cut the layer into 2 bits, and then I can sort of extend that. So I've made a cut in the footage, but the nice thing is that I've cut 3 pieces of footage, but for the price of 1. So it's like very efficient. And then, so say for instance, I wanted to get to this frame here, and then I wanted it to hold frozen, like I want to do a freeze frame, there's a way to do that as well. You can basically remap the timing of a clip. So the way that I would do that, and you might find yourself doing this quite often, is I would sort of drag, I would copy the first clip. So I'd go Control C, Control V, and you'd see that it would duplicate it. And then we'd right click on it. And if you go to time and freeze frame, you'll see that it pops up with this kind of square keyframe icon. And what that's doing is it's basically freezing the footage for that frame. And because confusingly, there's a bit of transparency, so you can see the other layer beneath it. But basically, you can see that this frame is now frozen. So what I can do is I can take this little handle on the outside of the clip, and I can drag it. And then for the duration of this clip here, that's all going to be frozen, so nothing's going to move. And then if I turn that one back on, you can see that it will play through, and then it will freeze, and then it will continue. So it's a good method for kind of like introducing stops and breaks into your footage, because sometimes it's just nice. It's nice to be able to like control that time. Does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone have that was definitely a bit of a fiddly thing that I just did. Don't know if anyone has a question. Feel free to jump in if it comes to you. That's pre-composing. You can also sort of like play around with time and stretch it and compress it using time remapping. So what I did there was a freeze frame, but what you can also do is time remapping. So if I right click on the layer, I go to time and then enable time remapping. What it does is it puts this is where you have to start thinking 4-dimensionally or 5-dimensionally. It puts a keyframe in the layer to indicate the time at which that layer is existing. And then so you can see that as I move through the timeline, the value increases. And currently that number is, can you see that okay? Currently that number is going up as the frames increment. But if I want, I can force it to be a different time. So I can sort of stretch and squish time. So if I were to, so say we're going from here from frame 0 to frame 190, frame 200 basically. But say I wanted that duration just to be between frame 0 and frame 50. I can just type in 50. And now it's going to stretch that clip so that it's only 50 frames. So it's 50 frames of content across 200 frames of composition, if that makes sense. So I've stretched it out so it should play back a bit more slowly. Yeah, so you can see it's sort of like stuttering along because it's been slowed down. And then it freezes, and then it carries on. So, did you hear the sound there, by the way?
Yeah.
It will do that because it will do that with sound as well, which is quite trippy. You can sort of experiment with soundscape. There was a trend on YouTube a while ago where people would upload like pop music but slowed down like thousands of times to make it sound like amazing ambient like soundscapes. So you can like listen to Justin Bieber like slowed down 8,000 times and it sounds like amazing whale music. So that's something to play around with, and possibly use as your final soundtrack. So yeah, we have time stretching. We have, what else do we have? There's a really useful animation feature called Wiggle, which I should show you. So what Wiggle does is it basically applies random motion to an object. So if I make a new composition quickly, and then if I add if I go right click, new, and then add a shape layer, and then if I add some lines onto here, maybe just some kind of a basic shape, maybe if I take away if you want to change the fill of an object, you can click on this fill button, the text, not the color. If you click on the fill, it will allow you to disable the fill for that object, and then you can sort of like draw lines. But anyway, I'm just making a sort of basic object to demonstrate this thing called Wiggle, which is that basically does random motion. So if I go to my, this is my effects and presets window. If you don't have it, you can go to Window, Effects and Presets, or Control 5. Control 5 is the hotkey. Type in wiggle, whoops, and then wiggle position will randomly vary the position of that thing. So if I put a wiggle on this, you can see it starts kind of like moving on its own. And that random motion can be quite useful for various, adding detail, adding interest to like the composition that you're making. And you can set the speed, so I can change it to a speed of 10, and you see it starts wiggling a bit faster. I can change the amount of wiggle, so I can make it wiggle by 100 pixels instead of 50 pixels, maybe just 10. And then it becomes really interesting if you start to combine that with like the motion blur, and then you start to kind of like get more kind of interesting. Let me just crank up the motion blur a little bit to like 720. So you can start to really like bring an object to life just by kind of like wiggling it around, which is quite an interesting thing that you can do. That doesn't have to be shapes. It can be any part of your drawing, any part of your composition. It could be another piece of footage. It could be a 3D object that you've rendered. It's a good feature to know about. There's another feature called an effect called echo, which you might find useful as well. And what echo does is it's quite similar to motion blur, and it will leave a trace of the object over multiple frames. So to show you what I mean, this is without motion blur. But then if I search for echo and drag that onto my shape as an effect, you can see that we get the echo settings here. Also, if you want to disable an effect, you can kind of click on this FX button and it will turn it on and off, which is quite nice. So with the echo effect turned on and the wiggle turned on, you can see that it's kind of like leaving like each frame. It's not very clear, but maybe if I crank up the number of echoes, you can see that for 10 frames, it's leaving a trace behind. So it's kind of like echoing in time as the clip is playing. And so you could set the decay amount, so you can set it to fade away as the echo takes place. So if I set that to 0.8, then you can see kind of like the trails get a bit fainter as time goes on. So if I decrease the speed and increase the amount, then you can see those kind of like echoes coming through, and you get this sort of like, I don't know, it looks like a kind of 80s style monitor for like a PC game or something. I just thought that was an interesting thing to show you as a way of adding detail to your motion graphics. What else do we have? So another thing that you might find yourself doing and that you see very often in visual effects is this idea of green screening. So I'll just quickly show you how to do that. It's pretty basic. If you import, basically you got to shoot your footage with a green screen in the background. So I've got this one that I normally use of, you can either do the Queen or Shia LaBeouf. Which one? Does anyone have a preference? Okay, let's do Shia LaBeouf. Okay, so we can put him into a new composition, and so he's recorded his footage with a green screen background, which means that we can do what's called keying. We can key it out. And so if I go to my effects and I search for key light, this is probably the best one to use, key light version 1.2. I don't know what is good about version 1.2, but it tends to work. And if you drag that effect onto your footage, and then you choose what's called the screen color, you can use this little eyedropper tool, and then you can just click on the green that you're interested in, and you can see that it turns to black, but actually it's transparent. So if I turn on my transparency grid, you can see that it's gone through all of the pixels, and it said like, okay, if there's a green pixel within a certain threshold, make it transparent. So we've basically kind of like keyed out the background so that we have so we've got basically the transparent background on there. And the nice thing about that is that we can now put other objects into the scene. So if we wanted to put like a rectangle behind him, we could do we can draw a rectangle, give it a fill, and then we can actually just drag that behind his head, and then he'll be kind of composited in with the objects in the scene. Or if you wanted to like duplicate your subject, so if I wanted to duplicate him, I could just copy the layer and then put him beside himself, and then he would be. Sorry, that's a bit loud. And then he would be overlaid multiple times, and then you can kind of like. So it's nice because you can separate your subject from its environment and superimpose it onto a new environment. You know all this. This is just like you can do this on Zoom. It's like it's built in, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, so that's how you do green screen. You can also play with these values. You can tweak them to change the variation of the edge of the key. So if you change like the gain, for instance. Sorry, maybe if I delete one of these just to make it a bit clearer. If you change the screen gain, you can see that it slightly changes the edge detail. And if you push it too far, you can see that the green color comes back because it's no longer detecting it. But you can also do you can do an inside mask. Basically, there's lots of kind of features that you can play around with, and the reason that there are so many parameters is because inevitably, when you're shooting your footage, something goes a bit wrong, or the lighting isn't quite what you expected on the day. So there's like a little bit of variation in the green in the background. So all of these settings are designed to help you mitigate small problems that occurred on the day of filming, as often occurs. So that's good. So it's good to just play around with these. There's probably lots of tutorials online that you can go to find out how to really tweak those for your particular footage. But that's basically how to get started. Yeah, okay, so does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone have any like questions or queries on that? Makes sense or good? Thumbs up if it's good. Nice. Okay, so I'll just go back to my sheet and have a think about what else to show you. Okay, yeah, so maybe now is a good time to do some motion tracking. So you've probably seen this on TV. You may have done it yourself. I don't know exactly how much experience you will have with After Effects, but motion tracking is an incredibly useful tool for analyzing footage, overlaying footage, annotating footage, stabilizing footage. So I just want to kind of like give you a little introduction as to how to get started on that. So if we have a piece of footage like, what's a good one to use? Maybe, actually I had this clip that I got very recently. It's this fun fair in Vienna. It's quite a nice piece of footage to work with. So for instance, you might want to say like annotate this footage with a label that's like pointing at one of the elements in this video. So I'm just trying to think what might be a good object to point at. So for instance, if you wanted to like have a label that pointed to this tree and said, look, here's an example of nature in the middle of this fun fair, we can track the motion of. So we can zoom in and we can just say like these pixels here, track those pixels, just tell me how they move over time. And theoretically motion tracking can allow you to sort of like work that out automatically, because you can see from the footage that it's wiggling around quite a lot. And by extension, you can then use that positioning to stabilize the footage as well. So I'll show you how to do that. So this is a good clip to work with if you want to try it out. So what I've done is I've taken my layer and I've dragged it into a composition. So I've got a composition with one layer, and then with the layer selected, what you want to do is go to the animation menu and go to where it says track motion. And then you'll notice that things have changed slightly. So there's this kind of gray, we're in a slightly different mode. We're not looking at the composition anymore, we're just looking at the layer. There's this kind of gray bar along the bottom here, which means that we're in motion tracking mode essentially. And you can see that this track point has appeared in the middle of the scene as well. And it's got a few different parts to it. It's got the crosshair in the middle, which is like the center point for the track. It's got this first square shape. That's that's called the pattern. And what that's doing is it's looking for pixels within that square that are that pattern. So within a certain tolerance, it's going to keep trying to find that pattern every frame through the footage. And then you've got this other square on the outside, which is called the search area, and that's how far from the previous frame it will look to find the next frame. So if we take the tree, for example, if we pop it on the top of the tree, so the pattern it's going to look for is this configuration of green and brown and grey and blue pixels. It's going to keep looking for that each frame, and it's going to look as far as this search area. So normally I increase the search area slightly, but the thing to remember is that the bigger you set your search area and the bigger you set your pattern size, the more work it's going to be for your computer to calculate and search for it. So it's good to keep it. You want to find a balance between too big and too small, basically. But once you've sort of defined that shape that you want to track, you can use these. You should have this window here, which is like the sort of motion tracking tool panel, and you can press this button here to analyze one frame forward to begin with, and you can see that what it's done is it's noticed that the pattern has shifted. I've just clicked it a few times there, and you can see that that bit of tree has moved from here to here to here to here, frame by frame. And if you have a good track, you can press play, and it will basically just start automatically following those pixels for you. This is working quite nicely because it's very high contrast. It's like clear skies. There's nothing obstructing the track. It doesn't always work quite as easily as this. If you find that there's an error or it makes a mistake, you can always go back and manually reposition the track for that particular frame. So you can kind of give it guidance as you go. And so you can see this wiggly path here is the motion of the tip of that tree throughout the footage. So we can sort of scrub through and we can see it being tracked. And the other thing that's important to keep an eye on is that this is now starting to put data into my footage. So if I use the U shortcut and expand the frames keyframes that I'm using, you can see that it's got an attribute for tracker, attribute for track point 1, and it's got these 3 kind of parameters for how confident it is that it's tracked it successfully. So, and you can see if I press play and I keep tracking, it's going to keep adding data to my layer. So maybe I can just track it all the way through, get to the end. Get to the end of the footage for you. So just let it finish. Sometimes it needs a bit of guidance as well. Sometimes you'll notice that the track just kind of like drifts and goes wrong. But this piece of footage is quite nice because it works quite easily. So yeah, you can see that it's now got a keyframe for every single frame, and for that particular set of pixels, which is nice. So what we can do is we can take this tracker object, we can convert it into that object that we talked about before called a null. So the null is just, as I mentioned before, like the empty container for just referencing an object. And the reason that you do that is because you can't actually directly use this tracker in your footage. You have to kind of sort of somewhat convert it to an object to make it work. Does that make sense to everyone? Does everyone follow? Does anyone have a question? Oh, good. All right. Well, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a null object in my layer. It's going to right-click New, Null Object. And you won't see it straight away, but you have to, it's a bit fiddly, you have to go back to your, you have to click on your tracker, I think. And then the weird thing is if you don't make the null first, you have to just, I think it's a bug, but you can't choose this option, apply, you have to kind of just fiddle this, and then you go back to transform. So if you change that to something else, doesn't matter what, and then put it back to transform. Okay, so I accidentally created some new tracks here, sorry. So I accidentally, I chose perspective corner pin, I think, and it added a bunch of new tracks that I didn't really want. So I'm just going to delete those. But now that I've toggled it, you can see I have this option to apply. And what that's going to do is it's going to apply the motion of my track to the null. So if I press apply, and then this dialog pops up, and it's saying, what axis do you want to apply that motion to? And the only option is well, okay, you can apply it to X and Y, X or Y. I'm going to choose X and Y. And you can see that it's applied that motion to the null. So now this null object is following the tree. So we've kind of like successfully annotated the tree, if you like. And then, like for instance, we can put like a text object into the scene. So we could say new text, and then if I type tree, I can position that over the tree. And then do you remember before how we were doing that parenting thing where we parented an object to a null? You can do the same thing here. So you can take the tree and you can say that I want to parent that to the null object. So now if I press play, you can see that the text tree is following the tree, which is quite a cool effect. And that's how they do that. You know, that's how you do all of those things where you have like a sort of cool like annotated overlay onto the object. There's another thing you can do, which is to put a beam, what's known as a beam, into your scene. So if I make a new solid object, just make it red. If you search in the effects for beam, this is a very useful. Say you wanted to draw a line between that null and a piece of text. If you put a beam on your solid, you see that the solid kind of disappears, and you get this sort of like lightsaber object in your scene. And that lightsaber is moving between these 2 points. So you can see that there's these little handles, but it's only occupying the middle section. So you want to set your length to 100%, and you can like increase the hardness of that shape and set the color as well. So say I just wanted it to be like a white line, I can change the. Basically, it's a fancy way of saying draw a line where you define the endpoints. But the really nice thing is that you can take, like I could take this end and I could say always follow the tree. And the way that I do that is using the what's called the pick whip. And so the pick whip, if you didn't know already, is this little spiral icon that you see next to your attributes. So it's like a little swirly, I don't know, pastry next to the attribute. So I can say like if I'm interested in like snapping one attribute to one other object, I can use the pick whip to define what I want it to follow. So I want my endpoint, this bit here, to follow the tree. So I need to get my my null object transform. So you kind of have to have both of them visible in the editor. But if I then choose the pick whip for the endpoint and then drag it, and you get this little like line that you draw out from it, you can tell that to follow the position of the null. So there you go. Now now that end of the beam is following the tree. So I could like, I could disconnect my my text. I could tell it not to follow that anymore, and then I could just put the text on this end of the beam. And then if I were to just look at my footage, you can see one end of the beam is following the tree, and the other end of the beam is just sitting in the same place next to the text. So I'm always labeling the tree like, throughout the footage. So that's a good way to annotate footage, for example, if it's moving a lot. Was that was quite a lot of steps. Did anyone have any like difficulties or trouble following, or want to ask a question?
I just want to ask you how just the first step to bring the tracker. I've missed that one tiny little.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So basically, so you can add more. So if I just show you how I add another one, that would be a good way to show you. So you select the footage that you want to track. So in this case, it's my my video layer. And then if you go to animation and track motion, then you'll see a track point will appear. And then you can move that to an object or a set of pixels. You could track this thing, this spinny roller, the sort of fairground ride, but I can tell you now it'll probably be a bit complicated because the pixels disappear at certain points and come back and go away again. So maybe if I just track this, maybe if I like track part of the Ferris wheel here. Yeah, so you set the position of what you want to track, and you have to kind of like, actually I didn't really explain it properly. You have to kind of like click in between the squares, because if you click on the squares, it changes the size. It's kind of a fiddly, like, weird object, but you put your you sort of target it on the bit that you're interested in, and then once you've done that, you should have this tracker window. If it's not there, you can probably go to Window and Tracker to enable it. And then you can basically, if it's good footage, you can press play and it will automatically start tracking the pixels for you. But sometimes it can go a bit kind of like haywire, so you have to kind of like put it back on track. And if it's finding it difficult, often going frame by frame is more reliable than pressing play, because when you press play, it uses like a slightly different algorithm to compute the frames. So it's good to sort of like tweak it a bit and sort of like make sure that it's, keep an eye on it basically, make sure it's not doing anything, make sure it's not going rogue. But yeah, that's basically how you set up the track. And then once you've got the track, actually, to be honest, you probably want to create the null first, but basically in order to actually use the position of the tracking, you have to convert it into another object that's properly visible. So I use the null object. It doesn't have to be a null, it could be like a shape or some other object, but you want to create a null object, and then you want to press apply, and when you press apply, it will use the coordinates that it's calculated to change the object. And there, I think, unfortunately, it seems to have done something weird. I think it's applied it to the wrong object. But yeah, if you just have a null and you just have the tracker, then it will apply the track to the null, and then you can use the null as the parent. Does that make sense? It's a bit of a complex set of steps, but hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yes, thank you very much.
It's all right.
Yeah, thank
you. So, probably a good thing to show you now would be stabilization, because it's very closely linked to motion tracking. So, sometimes you have a piece of footage that's shaky, and you're not interested in like tracking points. You just want to like make it like more stable, more like a tripod shot. And there's a few different ways to do that. So if I'm just going to like delete these layers and start again. Maybe if I put this clip back into a new composition. You can use what's called the warp stabilizer, and that's really good for stabilizing footage generally. So if you search for warp stabilizer, you can drag that onto your footage, and it will basically start automatically analyzing the footage. So it's going to put lots of track points on there without even showing you, and it's going to basically start looking at how the motion of the clip is changing, and then it's going to use its algorithm to essentially like stabilize the motion of the pixels. So you can see here it gives you like a little progress report. It's doing what's it at? It's like frame 100-ish, so it's about halfway through. So it could take a little while to compute, but it tells you how it's doing as it goes through. So we're at about 50%. And we'll be using something similar later on to do camera tracking. It's quite the motion tracker in After Effects is often very good at like just automatically working out what motion is going on in your scene. So it's quite good to use it as a sort of like first attempt if you're trying to like motion. So now you can see that the bar has changed to orange and it's stabilizing. So it's now hopefully stabilized the footage. So if we play it through, so you can see that it's not completely stable, but the motion is like all kind of like fluid and smooth. So what it's done is it's looked at how the pixels are moving and it's kind of like tamed them slightly, and it's cropped the footage as well so that you're not seeing the whole thing. I might just turn the sound off because it's a bit annoying. And you can see that there are different parameters inside the stabilization setting. So there's smoothness, which is like how smooth the motion is, but you can choose, like, instead of having smooth motion, you can choose no motion, and that will do another pass. It will go through, it will stabilize it again. It will try and make sure that nothing is moving, and that's actually an impossible task because there's always going to be some kind of motion. But you can see now if I play through the footage, it, like, the relationship between points in the screen isn't really changing that much. Like, the distance between here and here is basically the same throughout the footage, and they're not really moving the screen, but it's kind of like, it's kind of glitching and wiggling, and that's because it's doing I think it's this thing here, subspace warp. So it's taking the underlying footage and it's like warping it on a matrix. So it's like if you were to get someone to do like a perspectival distort in Photoshop for every single frame, so that they like roughly look the same. But it's a very powerful tool for like stabilizing footage generally. But sometimes that doesn't work and your footage is just too chaotic. So you can also stabilize with a manual tracking point that we used earlier for the motion tracking. So if I go to track motion like I did before, and I track, say, this thing here, I don't know what that is, like a CCTV camera or something. If I track the motion of that over a number of frames, if we just let it play through, you can use, what we'll be able to do is use this track point as a basis for stabilizing the footage. So the automatic process works quite well most of the time, but sometimes you have a very specific type of footage that's like very grainy or very poor quality, and this is a good method for stabilizing it in that instance. So if we just wait a little bit, so that will do. So we've managed to track this point here, and so this time, instead of using the transform with a null, I'm actually going to change the property to stabilize. And you can also use 2 points to stabilize rotation and scale. So if you want, you can specify two positions, and then if you track all of those frames, it will work out how the footage is rotating and how it's scaling, because it's using two, like pinch to zoom is a way of manipulating an image on your phone. Like, this is kind of like using pinch to zoom with 2 points to like stabilize the footage, but we'll just use one for now because we'll just use position basically. So with that point selected and stabilize selected, I can press apply and then choose the dimension X and Y. And now what it's going to do is it's going to keep moving the footage around that point. So that kind of CCTV camera there is going to stay locked to that position throughout the footage. So the footage is playing back now, but everything is centered around that object. So that object is always going to stay where it is. Well, except for the end there where I forgot to track it. But you can see the effect that has on the footage is that it moves it outside of the canvas and it starts kind of wiggling around, that object, which is quite an interesting. Like so say you were doing like, I guess I use this sometimes at work, like if we're doing like forensic analysis of a subject in a piece of footage, this kind of stabilization is very useful because it allows you to focus in on one object. And you can use that in combination with the echo effect that I showed you before to leave a trace. So you can see how we're kind of like moving outside of the frame and we're losing bits of the footage. You can actually use the echo effect to sort of like paint a panorama of the previous frames onto the canvas. So if I set this to composite in front, and then I leave a trail of like 25 frames. Maybe you can't see it. Maybe it's. I need to maybe put more of them on. Oh no, sorry. Maybe it's composite in back. Is that right? Ah, okay, yeah. So it doesn't. We have to do one thing before this works, which is that we have to pre-compose. We have to pre-compose the footage. So if I use that pre-composed thing that I showed you before, and put it into a new composition, and then I apply the echo to this composition. And then use those settings, composite in front. We should see that like leaves behind a bit of a trail. Composite in back. Sorry, I don't know. I'm not sure why that's not working. But the idea is basically that you can use the echo effect to create this to kind of create this like background panorama, which is all of the positions that the footage has been in over time. So that was quite a lot of stuff as well. Does anyone want to jump in and be like, oh, do you guys want to do like a breakout session? Do you guys want to go into a breakout room and try like going into groups? Is there any interest for that? Because like I'm aware that some of this like I may have like glossed over some detail in the process of going through like explaining that. It's very powerful though. Like it's really good. Like it's such a great tool to use for analyzing video and like stabilizing video and getting it under control. But we can also actually maybe in a little bit we should have another break. So let's have a little look at the sheet and see what's left. Feel free to just say something if it comes into your head. Like feel free to. I'm really happy to like have a intervention and like go off on a tangent if you want to. There's a really good subreddit called Pano GIFs which you can visit, and it's like a collection of like stabilized footage and panoramas that have been created using like motion tracking and stabilization. So this is this looks like a video of a lynx jumping across a river, but you can see it's got this kind of like frame on the outside where which is the stabilization, which is the motion of that video. So in the same way that we tracked a point on the funfair, they've tracked a point, maybe it's like something in the river, and they've used that to stabilize the footage and then composited it into a let's have a look at this video. Oh, there's someone slipping down and that looked a bit nasty. Sorry. There's lots of these kind of like interesting panoramas that normally it's like people doing skateboarding tricks and then like, you know, either pulling them off or like failing, but it can be used for all kinds of like, oh yeah, this is a nice one. It's a, oh wow, it's a person going down a waterfall in a kayak. But you can see there's this kind of like soft frame that moves across the image, and that's because this image is created by stabilizing or tracking a piece of footage and then compositing it back onto a panorama of the scene. Let's look at this one as well. Wow, okay, someone doing like a flip with the lightning. On this one you can see they've got, you can see the kind of like perspectival distortion of the frame, and then it's composited back onto the overlay. This is really nice actually. Some really good ones here that I haven't seen before. So yeah, feel free to like check that out. It's a really good. I'll put that in the. I'll tell you what. I'll put that on the sheet here. Yeah. So what else is there? There's. So it's probably good to show you actually how to get. So it's all well and good making all this stuff in After Effects, right? But at the end of the day, we've got to find a way to actually export it and show it to other people. So it's probably good to just talk about. It's a bit boring, but how to like get your footage out of After Effects and into another piece of software like a video player. So if we take this composition, for example, say I just want to export this as a video that I can send to my friend or whatever. The way to do that is probably best to use a media encoder. So if you don't have it installed, give it an install because it's worthwhile. You can technically render a animation within After Effects using this thing called the render queue, but I wouldn't recommend it because it's very it's kind of antiquated actually and a bit sort of like hard to use. So I'd actually recommend getting your composition, whatever it may be. I'll just use this one, and with the composition sort of open, you can go to File, Export, and then add to Adobe Media Encoder queue. It's the most exciting thing. Not the most exciting thing. But,
wait, Nick,
sorry.
Can I just barge in for a second?
Yeah, sure, please.
I can't stress enough, do not export from After Effects because it often exports like in an uncompressed format, and then students end up with 24 gigabyte files and they're like, I spent all day trying to move it from one hard drive to the next, and I couldn't show it at tutorials. Always go through Media Encoder. Basically, like a minute or 2 minutes of video should not be more than like 500 megabytes usually. Somewhere between 100 and 1.5 gigabytes. That's your sort of. Sorry, I just wanted to say that because I see it a lot happening.
Yeah, this is a traumatic point. It's like it's worth mentioning. Yeah, I think the default. Yeah, like if you use the render queue, the default settings that come with it are like basically uncompressed frames. So sometimes you want that, like if you're working on a very specific, very high fidelity part. But for most purposes, normally you want to encode your video to make it a reasonable size. So yeah, definitely use Media Encoder whenever you can. So once you've exported to Media Encoder, you'll see that it pops up in this. It should pop up as an item in the list, and if you click on the export options here, you get to choose how it's exported. So the first thing here is the codec. I believe that's the encoding method used to. So currently it's using H.264, a perfectly good way to encode video. For general purposes. If you were doing like a very absolute final high quality export, you might want to change it to, or often if you're working sort of like, I don't know, industry standard, although I'm not exactly sure what that means. The highest quality is probably to use a DNX HR, but I would say avoid that until the very end because it's going to produce a very big file. H.264 or like H.265 or yeah. Those are quite good as kind of like compressed video formats, and then you've got your and then here you can choose the bitrate settings. So bitrate means how much data is in each second of footage. So Media Encoder will be able to sort of like dynamically adjust how dense that data is. So if you set it to high bitrate, it will choose an option. Okay, so if you click on it, you get more settings. If you click on the blue bit, you get more settings, and it's probably good to just explain those quickly. So it gives you, the nice thing is it gives you a preview of your footage. It lets you kind of scrub through so you can kind of like see what you're exporting. Quite nice to know that you're exporting the right thing because sometimes it can take a while. And then inside of here you've got options to export video, export audio. Sometimes you don't want the audio. This doesn't have any audio, I don't think, so I'm not going to bother. And then down here in the video tab, you've got these different settings, but the most important one is probably the bitrate settings down here. And currently it's set to VBR, which means variable bitrate, which means that if there's a lot of information in the video, it's going to use lots of data. And if it's like just blank, it's not going to use very much data. It's going to change the data rate based on the video. But you can also use CBR, which is constant bitrate, and that's going to fix it. So it's going to say always use 10 megabits per second. So no matter what the video is showing you, just crunch it down, like compress it, make sure that it's 10 megabits per second. And that's good if you've got like a limitation on your file size, like it has to be under 30 megs or something. Or your hard drive has run out of space and you need to like keep it down. So I'd probably leave it on the default, which was the VBR, variable bitrate, for this H.264 setting. It comes with a bunch of presets. So if you know that you're going to upload it to YouTube, high quality, then go for the YouTube setting because it will automatically set your VBR settings for you. So here you can see it's chosen 16 megabits per second. So it's quite hard to know exactly what you want to begin with, but you play around with it and you might find that normally the default is good enough, but it's good to know where the option is. So yeah, all of that stuff can be changed if you need to, but default's a good way to get started. You can press OK. The nice thing about Media Encoder is that you can simultaneously export different versions of your footage. So if I select this and I say I want a high definition version for my own computer, and I want a low res version to send to someone over the internet because I don't want it to use as much space, you can press this duplicate button and it creates another instance of that export, and then you can choose like, for instance, maybe like medium bitrate, for example, without sound. And so you get two different versions. Or another thing that you might want to do is you might want to export a series of still frames rather than a video. Often that's more useful for your whatever you're doing. So you might want to duplicate it again and say, also, whilst you're at it, if you could export me like a PNG sequence, that would be great. So, well, actually, PNG sequence might take up a lot of space, but so I'm going to choose a JPEG sequence. And so you can tell it to export a JPEG sequence. And then the final sort of like column item is where it's going to put these files when it encodes them. So this is going to, I'm just going to put these on my, on like a sort of temporary folder on my D drive. So, and you can set them all at the same, if you select all three at the same time and click the value, it will edit all of them simultaneously. So that's quite nice. I can just get them all, put them all in the same folder. So you can see that they're now all going to be exported to my temporary folder that I've specified. And then all you have to do is press play. And sometimes you want to, and you can see it's encoding all three of them simultaneously. If you have a lot of exports and you have a lot of stuff to go through, sometimes you want to like queue these up and then press export before you go to bed. And then you wake up in the morning and you either find that you've successfully exported all of your clips or that there's an error message and you just needed to click OK. So be wary of that. Yeah, so basically it's a really nice way to sort of like line up all of your exports and sort of process them easily, really. And then once they're done, you can click on the URL or like the file location link, and it should take you to that folder. Yeah, so here it's taking me to the temp folder, and I've got one MP4 file that I've exported. And here I've got another one, two different versions. This one's like, I think this is the medium bitrate one. And it's got no sound because I chose no sound for that one. And then also in this folder, it's given me like hundreds and hundreds of still frames. So it's taken my video and for each frame it's saved a JPEG. So I've got like a frame sequence. And I could import these back into After Effects if I wanted to, or if somebody else needed to. If you have a very heavy render from like a 3D software, it's often good to do it frame by frame because sometimes your software will crash. It's an unfortunate reality. Or sometimes you'll realize halfway through, hang on, I forgot one of my render settings. I want to like restart the render. But then at least you can preview what you've got and you can restart it at a certain stage. So sometimes rendering frame by frame is better. But you can open the frames and just kind of scroll through them. So if I go through this, just like going through frame by frame. If you want to, like a good way to view frames is this software called DJV. So if you type in DJV, it's a really good program for like quickly scanning through lots and lots of frames, open source as well, so it's easy to get your hands on. And you can open, so if I go to open with, sorry if you're on a Mac, I'm aware that might be a different issue. I think it might be built for Mac though. If I choose DJV, you can see that it will load all of them as a kind of like a mini video player, and then I can kind of like scroll through those frames using this kind of interface, which is a lot nicer than using the standard like click click click, because I can actually sort of like play through them here, and I can scrub through the timeline as well, and it's kind of cool because that's not looking at a video, that's looking at individual frames, so it's quite an interesting way to navigate through still images.
Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. No, please interrupt whenever. Yeah.
Now a student disconnected. So would you be able to let him?
Oh yeah. Sorry, I see it. That's no problem.
Thank you.
Let me know. Yeah, if that comes up. Yeah. Thanks for jumping in there. I don't always realise that they've popped up. Oh yeah. Look, you can download it for Mac as well. So that's good. Or if you're on a Linux, I don't know if anyone uses Linux. It is possible. You can do it, but you have to use more open source software. I don't think you can get Adobe for Linux. That would be a strange thing, wouldn't it? Yeah, so maybe, okay, what have we got? So I think what would be really great, just to finish off, would be to tie off some loose ends, but also to do some to do a quick camera track. So a camera track is where you like reverse engineer the motion of a camera so that you can export it to 3D. And then I thought it would be really good if at the end of today we just all have managed to export export a 3D camera into Cinema 4D. Or if you fancy, you can go through and export some of the sort of like techniques that we looked at today using Media Encoder as well. That would also be a good thing to test out. But if it's okay with you, I think perhaps we should have another 5-minute break, and reconvene at let's say we'll come back here at 2:25. 2:25. Does that sound okay? So in 7 minutes, we'll just have like a little break, grab a drink, and then we'll do some camera tracking, and then talk about some other stuff. You can ask some questions. You can ask questions anyway, but yeah. Back here at 2:25. Have a quick break. See you soon. Hey guys. Hope you're still there. If you're with me, give me a thumbs up or something to that effect. Nice. Good stuff. Hey. Good stuff. Okay. Welcome back. Hope you had a little break. Got a drink or something. Oh, I'm just going to shut my door, sorry. Alright. So yeah, I thought now we could just kind of go through how to track a camera and just export that to Cinema 4D, just so that we get a foot in the door for next workshop 3D, just to sort of like get you interested in that as well. So I'll share my screen again. Were there any like bits and pieces left over that anyone wanted to ask about? Was there any like anything unclear, or just that you wanted to like?
Actually, I wanted to know how you did the pick whip.
The pick whip.
How did you select the end of the line? Because I could only see anchor points, but I couldn't find the start and the end. Like, and when you open the,
for the beam with the 2 points.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'll go. Yeah. Absolutely. That's a good. Yeah. It's quite a fiddly. So let me. I'll tell you what. I'll make a new composition, and then I'll just do it with because it might be a bit sort of more, a bit clearer. So I'll just put a solid, and then I'll get my beam again. Put my beam on the thing. So whoop, there it is, the lightsaber, and then we set for some reason it doesn't cover the whole length of the beam. I don't know why. It would be probably better if it did, but if we set the length to 100%, then we get these 2 points to control the beam. And so the question was, how do you get how do you link an object like a null to the end of the beam? So I'll create a null object as well. So we've got a null and a beam, and I want this end of the beam to follow the null, so I can just kind of like pull it around. So what you do, you go to the layer with the beam, which is the solid, and then you go to the beam effect. So yours might be collapsed like this. So you might have to go to effects, beam, and if the effects aren't there, then you probably
I think that's where I missed. I thought it was in the transform,
but yeah, sorry, of course. So so it's like a transform within a transform, or like a subcategory. That's probably it.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
But then you can just for anyone following through, you can take the position of that null. You can grab your pick whip. Very useful pick whip. Actually, there's something else to tell you about pick whips as well. So and then you can put that onto the starting point or the ending point, and now actually, I think what I've done is I've made the null the child of the beam. So if I move the beam, then the null's going to move. But actually, you might want to do it the other way around. So you might want to say, you might want to tell the beam to follow the null, if it makes any sense. So that in that case, I'd choose the the beam endpoint, and I'd use that pick whip, and I'd move it to the null position. So it's like one of them is driving the other, and it's normally more useful to have the null driving the beam, I think, but it varies from project to project. But what I was going to say is that when you create a pick whip, you're actually creating a small script, so you're actually like doing a tiny bit of coding at the same time. And so you can see that the pick whipped attribute has got red numbers, and that means that. Sorry about that. That means that they are being described with a function. So if I expand my ending point, you can see that we've got this little bit of text here, which is like a mini script that's telling it to do something. So it says this comp, so that means this composition, dot layer, so look for a layer, and then null 3, so look for the layer called null 3, which is our null layer, and then dot transform dot position, which is this attribute here, which is the position attribute. So it's saying in order to get these numbers for the endpoint of the thing, find them in this other layer. So what's nice about that is that you can modify this script. So if you go into the text here and you were to say plus 20, so if I typed in plus 20, it's going to add 20 to the value of that null object, I think. So now you can see that it's moved slightly to the left. Actually, if I make that a bigger number to make it more obvious, if I make it like 100, you can see that it's following. Okay, that was a confusing number as well, because now it's gone to the other corner. But if I say an even bigger number, like 200, plus 200, you can see that the null is controlling the beam, but with an offset of 200. So you can say, like, you can use the pick whip as a starting point for driving two objects, and then you can kind of augment it and say, actually, I want you to take that value but multiply it by 2. So instead of like plus 100, you could do multiply by 2 and see what happens. And you'll probably find that you get some quite interesting results, because you're kind of like amplifying the effect of that relationship. So it's good to think of it not as absolute, but something that you can tweak and you can play around with. And if you're into scripting, there's a whole bunch of like visual scripting that you can do along those lines. So that was a good question, because it leads very nicely into that bit. Okay, what should we do? Oh yeah, did anyone else have anything that they wanted to sort of like go over again? Were there any other bits and pieces?
I had a quick question just about general workflow. So would I would want to use Adobe After Effects to kind of work on would I do multiple compositions in one kind of project, or would I normally just do one at a time? And is the kind of idea that you would export that whatever you produce in After Effects, the video, to work with somewhere else, or do you do it in After Effects?
That's a really good question, and sorry, because it's probably something that I should have explained earlier on. So After Effects, and hopefully it's still useful, I think it is primarily for doing detailed composition, effects, layering, and very kind of like, if I can say, fiddly stuff, or like very kind of like complex manipulation of images. So in terms of workflow, yes, use After Effects to composite, to layer, to augment, to track, to convert. And then you're probably familiar with the software Premiere as well. That's a very good accompaniment. But Premiere is more to do with editing a long duration video. So if you have like a video that's 10 minutes long, maybe your final film, it may have a bunch of different After Effects files that feed into it. So if you want to like do timing for a voiceover, narration, if you want to kind of like think about the sort of pacing of your film, then that's the sort of thing you want to do in Premiere. After Effects is very much for the kind of very zoomed in, very forensic, if you like, very kind of like precise manipulation of images and media. And you can tell that it's like a little bit clunky, like it's a little bit hard to kind of like move strips around. And that's because it's very precise. So it's a feature, not a bug. And if you want to, and so you can use Premiere to put together larger sequences of clips. The reason that we go into After Effects a lot more is just because it's a lot harder to use. It's a lot more complex. Like Premiere, you can almost like pick it up and start going straight away. But I can actually show you how to use Premiere as well, just to give you an overview, which might be good. Hopefully that answers your question. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
So yeah, so like After Effects for the like defined detail stuff, Premiere for the kind of like directors, like emotional content, or like the timing, the pacing, the overall feel of it, really. Actually, no, I'll tell you what, I'll just launch Premiere and show you how to get started, because Premiere is a lot kind of easier to use than After Effects, which is why I put way more emphasis on After Effects. I'm pretty sure you'll be able to pick it up quite quickly because it's a fairly straightforward program. But I will just show you a few things to kind of like kick you off. And you can, interestingly, so what you can do is you can dynamically link an After Effects file into your Premiere file. So like we did pre-compositions, you can nest a live After Effects file into your Premiere, and then when you change your Premiere, it will update. Sorry, when you change your After Effects, it will update inside of Premiere. So I'll show you what I mean. So in Premiere, when you create a new project, you want to go File, New Project. And the annoying thing about Premiere is that you can't just start working. You kind of have to set it up a bit first, because it uses lots of parts of the computer at the same time, so it wants to know where to put the cache files and the all that kind of stuff. So if I just do a sort of demo project for you here, you want to give it a name, obviously, and then you want to specify where you're going to save your Premiere file. So this is your edit of the film. So I'm just going to put it in my temp folder for now. So it's going to be called Demo Project Dtemp. You can generally leave these settings at their default. One thing you might want to change is scratch disks. So something to be aware of when you're editing with video, there's a lot of temporary information that's created in order to cache the playback and make the playback smooth. So it's called, in Premiere, it's called rendering, which is where you like render a sequence so that you can play it back smoothly, because often the file is very heavy and it doesn't play back straight away. So scratch disks, this window here, is where Premiere is putting all of its like temporary files. And if you're not careful, they can really add up, and suddenly your hard drive is gone, so you don't have any space left. So it's good to keep track of where you're saving these files, because they can get really big. So you can see we've got captured video, captured audio, video previews. That's a big one. That takes up a lot of space. Audio previews. And for each one of these, you just want to make sure you put them somewhere where you know where they are, so that if your hard drive fills up, like you can even buy an external hard drive just for like putting these kind of cache files, because they're not integral to the project. They're just for previewing, but they take up a lot of space. So it's kind of worth putting these on an external hard drive, and then saying like scratch disks, put my video previews outside of my main computer, because they're not really that useful to me at the end of the day when I export. I've got mine all set up to like Adobe Cache. Like I made a folder called Adobe Cache, and I just send everything there. And then every so often I just delete it, because I know that it's not information that I need forever. So then it should launch the actual project. So it's giving me a warning that my audio configuration has changed. I'm just going to press no, because I don't want to change anything at the moment. And then this is actually not probably what it will look like. Yours will probably look a bit different, because I've customized mine. But maybe if I put it to the standard all panels. Okay, I wonder if there's a way to send it to the default, because this is a bit weird. Edit workspaces, maybe? No. Does anyone know how to reset the default of Premiere? You should see something similar, but like with a different layout. Editing, maybe. No. Oh yeah, okay. You'll see something like this probably. So this is the editing workspace. It's just kind of like lines at the moment, but very similar to After Effects. what you do is you take your footage and you drag it into this project window here, which is not at the top, is at the bottom, slightly different. But if you take your, so maybe if I take that Vienna Funfair one, drag it in there, then you can see that it's loaded that clip into my sort of like media bin, and it's there ready to use. And then in order to actually start using that and editing it, so you might want to like load in a bunch of stuff. So you might say, oh yeah, I want all of these videos, all of my shots that I've taken today. You might just want to drag them all in there, and you can organize it with folders, but they're called bins because it's like the video editing way of saying folder. So you can put everything into different bins. You can import your audio, your voiceover, your interview, whatever you've captured on that day. You can start to see this kind of like a high level way to organize your media. And then in order to actually edit something, you need to create a sequence. They're called sequences in Premiere. So you can go right click on this project area, new item, and go to sequence. And then you're going to have to unfortunately go through another bunch of like typing in settings. So sequence 1, say this is the first sequence of my film, like the first chapter, if you like. You want to probably choose, so you can either choose a preset, but these are very confusing. So sometimes I actually just go and create a custom preset by editing the existing one. So if I go to maybe like, so maybe if I start with, I find this very hard to kind of start with, but maybe if I choose this like 1080p thing here as a starting point and then go to settings and then I modify that preset, that's probably a good place to start. You can choose custom here as a custom setting. So I'd probably say go with custom and just set your own stuff, because otherwise you're going to get like a very specific movie industry like workflow style sequence. So here's something that you can just use out of the box. Custom, 25 frames a second. Frame size, I'm going to use 1920 by 1080 because that's the standard HD footage. Pixel aspect ratio, you want to make sure that's set to square, because currently there it was giving us anamorphic lens like pixels, which is crazy. Fields, you want no fields, progressive scan. That means that it's not, the footage isn't interlaced, it's not doing like the TV scanning thing. Display format, that's fine, 25 frames per second. Sample rate, that's fine, you can leave that as it is unless you're doing some very specific kind of audio work. I think those are probably quite good settings to go with, so you can screenshot that as a kind of like starting point. Press OK, and then it will actually load up. You'll see like a black screen here, and you'll get like a timeline very similar to After Effects, but you'll see that it's less in depth. So once you've done that, you can take your footage and you can drag it into your sequence. So if you drag multiple clips in, it will just kind of stack them all together. And here it's given me a warning because they have a slightly different settings to the sequence that I just created. So you can either adapt your sequence to match your footage, or you can keep your footage the same. Or you can keep your sequence the same, and it will just become a container. So I'm just going to keep my sequence settings because I don't want to change it. And then we can see actually it's done it in. It's done it as portrait. I'm really sorry. I think I must have just. I wanted it to be landscape, but I've set it as portrait. You can change it. So I think it adapted it to my footage, didn't it? I must have pressed the wrong thing. Yeah, I think it changed the sequence. So let's drag it in. Yeah, so I should have pressed this. I should have pressed keep existing settings. And then it's going to keep like a nice landscape format for me. So you can see it's imported my footage as like a sequence. If I had an After Effects file that I've been working on, I can also import an After Effects file. So if I go to the working material folder, go to AE, we've got something here. We've got this one, winter tracking one. So you can have a file linked as an After Effects file, and you can import a specific composition into Premiere. And then when you update your After Effects file, the updates will come through into Premiere, which is really nice because it means that you don't have to worry about re-importing it each time. So this is an After Effects file that's live. So if I change the After Effects file here, you see it pink in the timeline, that's going to update. So you can see that this is a way to kind of like start to zoom out and to bring in multiple sequences together as a composition. And down here we've got the audio channel as well. So you can add in layers of audio, you can add in multiple layers of video. Premiere is basically like a very higher level version of like the same process, but with less fine control. But you tend to find it has better performance qualities for like, you know, working on the timing, the pacing of your film and all that kind of stuff. And then when you're ready, you can just go File, Export, Media, and then you recognize this window from After Effects. It's the same window. It's just the standard media encoder video. And if you press Q, it's slightly different. But if you press Q, you'll see it pops up in media encoder, and then you can do the same thing that you did before, but with your Premiere file, with your high-level edit of the footage. And works the same. Does that make sense to everyone? I kind of rushed through that, so maybe I missed something. Premiere is quite intuitive, so you'll probably, I imagine you'll all probably be able to get your head around it quite quickly. You can do, and you have all these tools for editing as well. So like if you wanted to like, say this After Effects file, I wanted to cut it at this location. You can say, okay, get my razor tool, and then you can just click and cut it, and then you can delete that bit there, and then you've done like a nice precise cut. So it's good for like cutting and editing and like chopping and changing and slicing footage up. All good. Thumbs up if thumbs up if you're on board, or like if that made sense. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah, it's probably not worth spending too long on because you'll be able to hopefully find your own way. So I was thinking we've got 15 minutes left of official time, so let's do some camera tracking because it's quite fun, and you don't have to do that many clicks, so it's fairly like good for an end task. So file, I'm going to import this piece of footage that I found yesterday on my phone, which is like an underpass in Deptford. It's just a fairly nondescript underpass, but very good for motion tracking. So where is it? It's called Deptford Underpass. Do you know what? I'm actually going to create a new project because this project has got very crowded with stuff. So I'm just going to import Deptford Underpass. There it is. And it's just a video that I took a while ago just of going under here for this purpose of motion tracking. Because the nice thing about it is that it's a very kind of like rectilinear space. So it's got very clear like axes for the X, Y, and Z. And it's good for motion tracking as well. So I'm going to drag that footage into the composition, so the composition matches the footage, and there it is, it's in the composition. And then I'm going to search for camera tracker, so camera tracker, and there it is. I'm going to drag that onto the layer, and it will automatically just start tracking it for you. It's great. It's like you just have to sit and wait for it to do its thing. So it's initializing. It should give you an update of what it's doing. If you have like very high resolution footage, or if you have like quite a slow computer, it's going to take a long time to calculate potentially. It will give you a progress update, so it will say about 2 minutes remaining to track the footage. That's pretty good going. I mean, the After Effects camera tracker is quite good at tracking good quality footage. If you have low quality footage, then it's a bit dicey and you can't really be guaranteed a result. If you look at tutorials for this kind of thing, they'll always say like, make sure that you hold the camera steady, don't move it around too much. Often at work we deal with footage that can't be changed. That's the way it is, and that's what we have to deal with. So sometimes we have to do more manual processes. But because you are, in a sense, driving your own projects, you probably have a bit more control over how the footage is actually captured. So a few things to bear in mind are just to kind of keep the frame fairly under control. Like, don't do any like crazy like camera moves. It's okay to move from one frame to the next, but make sure that in between there's like enough kind of like points of reference. it's good also to make sure that the dynamic range is good in your footage, so you got like a good balance between the bright exposed areas and the underexposed areas. Like you don't want it to be completely overexposed because that can ruin the detail of the textures and stuff in the image. But yeah, I mean overall, like it's good just to kind of experiment and see what works, because some shots will just work really well and others just like refuse to track. Like it's very it can be quite unpredictable, but this one should work, so it's a good one to sort of demonstrate on. Does someone want to like jump in there?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So that basically the camera tracking is then to kind of take it to Cinema 4D and then track how the video goes with a model that we would create, right? So now I have a question. If that footage you've stabilized it with the warping stabilizer or with any other kind of tracker, right? That will affect your kind of end image that you want to put in Cinema 4D. So then do you track the camera before or after the effect?
So like, do you track it before or after the stabilization, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, before stabilization, but actually you can do it either way. It doesn't matter. And the reason I say ideally is because when you do a stabilization, often what happens is that the frame of the image gets cropped slightly to account for the wiggling. So it changes the fundamentals of what that, if you like, camera is, because it's like cropping an image is like changing the camera. It's like cropping the sensor inside the camera. So ideally you track it before stabilizing it, but that's not always possible. Sometimes you need to stabilize it.
Does the stabilization affect? So if you stabilize before, stabilize after, you'll get a different path of the tracker, right?
Kind of. You'll get like probably like a slightly different path, but more importantly, you'll get like a different focal length. So it would be like a different angle of field.
So do you recommend stabilizing after you've merged the 3D with the kind of afterwards?
It depends. Like you can actually do it either way around. So sometimes you'll find that you need to stabilize your footage in order to make it so that it can be tracked, because sometimes the footage is very shaky.
Okay.
But yeah, sorry, it's not a very good conclusive answer. But if you were doing like, if you're happy to crop it and you're happy to lose a bit of info, it's fine. Like you can definitely stabilize it beforehand. But if it's captured well enough, you hopefully won't need to stabilize it that much, if that makes sense. Sorry, it's not very
No, it's actually quite helpful.
But if in doubt, like do like a small video and just try it both ways and then see how it comes out. Like definitely experiment, because these things can be like weirdly complex when it comes to how they actually manifest in the end video. So like feel free to like just give it a test. Stefan, do you want to chime in? Oh, I see. No, sorry, I was just wondering. Oh, sorry, there's someone waiting to come in. Okay, so our track is complete, and we can't see anything. But if I click on the camera tracker here, you can see that all these little coloured icons have appeared, and that's normally a good sign. If they're sticking to the footage, that's normally a sign that you've tracked it quite well. So if you want to view those permanently, you can press render track points, and they'll come up in your final footage, just as a way to debug things. But now what we have is a solution for how this camera is moving. And if I press this button, create camera, it will create that camera object that we had before. We looked at it a little bit. And if I double click it, you can see it's worked out the optics of the camera based on my footage. Pretty amazing, right? It's actually worked out what camera I was using to take that footage just based on the pixels. So that's nice. And the other great thing about having that camera object is that it can now be exported to a 3D software. But before we do that, let's just try putting a few objects into this scene, because I just want to show you that it's actually 3D. So the easiest way to put an object into this scene for testing is to actually basically just go to these sorry, where are they? Go to the track points. Where are they? I'm just going to double click on the composition and then try and get them to show up again. Camera options. Yeah, okay. So what I had to do there is I had to go to my footage, go to the camera tracker effect, and just select it. And what that does is it enables this kind of like dynamic interaction with the points that it's tracked. So it's understood where these points are in 3D. And what you can do is you can like select a triangle here between 3 points. You can right click and you can go create a solid. And that will put like a little square in your scene. And that is a 3D object. So if I go to my layer here, you can see it's got the little 3D tag, which means that I can manipulate it in 3D. So if I rotate it on the x-axis, you can see it's rotating there. I can just line it up with wall. And now if I play my footage, you should see that sticks to its position in 3D. So what I've done there is I've basically put a object into the 3D space of the video that I captured. So that's quite a nice trick that you can do. And it's also good, it's good to put like a few objects into this before you export it to 3D, because it helps to give you a reference point for where things were. So if I wanted to know, like, After Effects doesn't intrinsically know that this is the opening to the tunnel. It just knows that there is a point there. So what you might want to do is like take, for instance, one of the points on the corner, like that one, and then you might want to just add a null on that object. And that will put like a tiny little marker just to tell you that that is the opening. So I could put one here as well. I could do like a null there, just sort of outline the opening. And so you can see it's created these like null objects, and they're all 3D. So they'll be very helpful when we take it into 3D for knowing where that opening is in 3D space. So the final step is just to export it. So hopefully this works. Go to, I think what we do is we go to our compositions. I think you have to have your composition selected, and you go to File, Export, and then you go to the Maxon Cinema 4D Exporter. And it will give you a dialog if you haven't saved your file saying you must save it. So I have to save it, unfortunately. So just save it in the temp folder. Let's call it untitled. So you have to save your file first. That's the first thing, sorry. And then you want to go to File, Export, Maxon Cinema 4D Exporter. And it gives you another warning just to say that some of the layers won't be exported. So it can't export the footage layer because it's not 3D. It doesn't know where it sits in 3D space, so it's not going to export that. But it's going to export the camera, it's going to export the nulls, and hopefully it's going to export that little pink rectangle that we put on the wall as well. So I'm going to press OK, and then save it as, give it a file name, Cinema 4D. And then I'm going to launch Cinema 4D, and hopefully you have the link to the educational licensing webpage. You should all be able to get free educational licenses that are valid for 6 months, and then you can renew them as long as you're a student. And then once you're inside Cinema 4D, you should just be able to open the file. So if I go to my folder where I saved it, this one here, Deptford Underpass, press open. I just opened that Cinema 4D file that I created. And in Cinema, without going into too much detail about the interface, you have a little section here which outlines all of the objects in your scene. And you can see we've got a camera, we've got a solid, and we've got 4 nulls, and they are defining the they're the points that we defined in After Effects. And if I move through the timeline here, you can see that it's like we've got some kind of a movement, we've got some kind of an animation. And I guess you could do it like a sort of side by side, but this is basically the same thing that we're seeing here in After Effects. So basically we've taken the motion of that camera and we've kind of transposed it into 3D. And you can actually, if you click this little crosshair target icon here, you can go outside of your camera, and then if you're lucky, you can navigate and you can see the camera. So if I press play on the timeline, that camera there bobbing along, that's actually me moving through the moving like into the underpass. So we've kind of like created the motion of that camera, and you can go inside of it. So now, what's useful about this is that we now have the ability to put 3D objects into our scene. And I think actually you can set a one useful thing is to set the original video as the background so that you have a reference. And I think you can do you can create like a background object. Create environment. I think, is it environment? Oh no, create. Oh yeah, so you can create this thing called a background object. And then I think you can add a material to it. Which is the texture, the video that we used. So if I go to I'll explain how all of these things work in another workshop, hopefully. But actually, that's the wrong type of material. So let me just create a new, material. I think I want like a default material as opposed to a sort of like fancy material. So I'm just gonna go to my color channel and I'm going to use the video as a texture basically. So if I go to my working material folder and select my, oh whoops, sorry, that was the wrong one, wasn't it? Sorry, I chose the wrong video. Hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. What was it called? It was called Deptford Underpass. There it is. And then if I go to the editor, where is it? I think I just need to turn on a few things. Animate preview. So that's one thing you have to turn on. You have to turn on the animate the preview. So now you can see that in 3D, the video is playing on top of the motion tracking. So we've managed to sort of like somehow go from 2D to 3D in the space, and perhaps I'll leave it there because that might be a good sort of like tantalize, like a cliffhanger for the next session. Yeah, I don't know. Does anyone want to like jump in? We're sort of at 3 o'clock now, so officially we've finished. But I'm very happy to sort of to be here and answer your queries. And yeah, thanks for making it through. Congratulations. Yeah. Any questions? Anyone want to like jump in? Thanks, Hendrik. That's great. Yeah, I mean, I'll upload the. Hopefully today I'll be able to upload it to YouTube as a private video, and then I'll send Stefan the link so you can all review.
Wait, did Hendrik have a question, or is he just waving?
No. I was just wondering if you will be able to repeat the last bit next time.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. We can start with this process.
Oh, I would just yeah. Thank you.
And I would say maybe it's because Nick is probably exhausted and probably can't answer everybody's questions now. Okay. But you know, it'd be worth reviewing the video and preparing questions for next session.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
But if you have any burning questions now, maybe we can do one or two. And
yeah, really happy to just help you out, because sometimes it's nice to just get a quick, because sometimes it's just such a little thing, isn't it? It's like one little button that you need to press. It can be very annoying. Or if anyone wants to share screens and like show what their problem is, if it's like we can try and diagnose it, something like that. But there's something flashing in my. Okay, cool. All right. Good stuff. Yeah, we'll be I guess we can share it with we can share the video with everyone. No, yeah, thanks. That's great. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you have like a particular sort of like technique, and maybe if there's a few of you that have the same technique that you're interested in, even better. Feel free to approach Stefan or make a note of it next time, and I can put it on the list as sort of like a priority to, like, maybe you're really interested in character animation, or maybe you're really interested in like materials and lighting, textures and stuff like that. We'll cover them anyway, but like if there's a particular like, or maybe you've like just seen like like an Instagram thing or like something that you thought was cool and you want to know how it was done, or I can try and help you with that.
I just quick question, Nick. Just do you? I mean, totally. I just throwing out shot out of cannon here, but do you know of any like specific reference that we might look at and maybe like be inspired by, like, and to come up with these things that we want to do in After Effects? Is there a good source of that? I don't know if there is.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's loads of like little bits and pieces. I think I put a few on the sheet. So there's this. Okay, well, this is kind of like a little bit like self-referential because I know that Alan Warburton was like on the panels last time, but he has a really good. I don't know. I think it's like a really good starting point. This video here, spectacle and speculation, is a really good kind of an entry point for thinking about visual effects in a more, I guess, like almost like philosophical way, but that's a really good entry point. There's an amazing film by this guy called Nikita called Ugly, which is very good if you're interested in like going into cinema 4D. It's like a film that's made entirely using the simulation systems within cinema 4D, and it's kind of like it's got a very distinctive aesthetic, which is based around using very low poly simulations. So I'd highly recommend that film if you want to get into it. I guess I don't know what else is good for kind of like inspiration. Sorry, go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, I mean, just basic inspiration. I would say any of the. I would take a good look at Alan Warburton's website.
Oh yeah.
Just because he has quite a good spectrum of sort of techniques and things that he explores. I would say almost any forensic architecture video is worth looking at because it follows a lot of the workflows that Nick has talked about, and sort of notions like the operative model, using a model as a way to aggregate images, videos, data, and things like that is really good. And then on a more basic level, once again, the Pantopia website, just because a lot of those videos that are there are videos that are essentially heavily done in After Effects. It's mainly just a lot of After Effects. So I would recommend those off the top of my head.
Don't be afraid to use Premiere as well. It's good for...
I would look at Vasilis's video from last year. It's on Pantopia and it's really worth checking out. I'll put it in the...
That's cool. Put it in the link, or on the sheet if you want.
Question to Stefan. How can we have access to Nick's documents that he was showing? Is it in the... Google?
You should be able to... I think I linked it in the chat previously. It's this one here. Let me just post it again. That should give you access to the Google Drive, and then you'll have all of the videos that I used today.
Perfect, thanks.
No problem. This guy's also really good if you're interested in sort of like a fun introduction to like very thorough like technical overview of how things like frame rate, color, aspect ratio, resolution interlace. Like if you really want to like drill down into some of the more like detailed technical sides of things, this guy's pretty good. Captain Disillusion. He does like his main channel is like debunking like viral videos of CGI, and like he'll go through and say, I can tell this is CGI because he uses like Smoke Pack Volume 3 for After Effects, and it's got this distinctive shape. So he's kind of like sort of like forensic CGI debunking, but he has a good kind of like playlist here for like technical aspects if you ever want to learn about frame rate, for instance, and the history of frame rate as well. It's quite interesting. But the technical is often an aperture into more interesting discussions anyways, well, at least from my perspective. Maybe it's not for everyone. Pantopia. I need to look a bit more at Pantopia. I heard lots about this website. I heard it's good. looks very good. Yeah. So I guess if there's any other loose ends, speak now or next time if you're busy.
I think on that note we can close the session.
Okay.
But thank you very much, Nick. I was sort of listening in the background, and it seemed super informative.
Good stuff.
So I look forward to seeing what happens, the outcome of all this on the other end.
It's gonna be fun. It's gonna be fun. Yeah.
All right. Goodbye, Nick.
Thanks, guys. I don't actually know how to hang up, so this is going to be awkward.
Just you can leave at the bottom.
I'll stop sharing my screen first.
All right.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you so much.
Good luck with it. Speak soon.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Well done for making it through. Cheers, guys. Thanks.
See you, Nick.
Yep.